China is facing disaster, not in some distant future, right now. For decades, we've heard about China's unstoppable rise, the economic miracle, the superpower in waiting, the country that's supposedly eating America's lunch while we argue on social media. But behind the gleaming skyscrapers lies a nation on the brink. What we're about to show you in this video will absolutely blow your mind, because the truth about China is far more shocking than anything you've been told. 50 million empty apartments threaten to wipe out the life savings of hundreds of millions of Chinese families. China imports 85% of its soybeans and could face mass starvation if those imports were cut off. The Chinese government destroyed its own tech industry, wiping out $1.5 trillion in market value overnight. And China's military, despite its massive size and budget, has a fatal flaw that makes it far weaker than it appears. And we're just getting started. As China's problems multiply, this weakness becomes increasingly dangerous for global stability. The signs of collapse are everywhere if you know where to look. Let's dive in with the most visible crisis that's already sending shockwaves through China's economy. 1. Real estate apocalypse. China's economy is built on the largest real estate bubble in human history, and it's imploding right now. An astonishing 70% of Chinese household wealth is tied to real estate, according to the People's Bank of China, compared to just 25% in the U.S. Housing prices have fallen for 28 consecutive months, according to China's National Bureau of Statistics, with no bottom in sight. The scale is mind-boggling. 60 to 80 million empty apartments as of August 2023, enough to house the entire population of Spain, sit unsold across the country. That's approximately $13 trillion of housing inventory going nowhere, according to Rogoff and Yang's research published in the American Economic Review. Major developers like Evergrande have collapsed, defaulting on over $300 billion in debt. Ghost cities stand half-finished, concrete skeletons abandoned mid-construction looking like something out of The Walking Dead. The situation has become so dire that homeowners have started mortgage boycotts, refusing to pay for homes that will never be completed. Over 400 stalled projects across 86 cities have seen payment strikes, according to researchers at the University of Hong Kong. When millions of families realize their life savings are evaporating, social unrest will follow, and it's already beginning. But what's happening with housing is just the tip of the iceberg. The debt situation beneath the surface is beyond comprehension. 2. Mountains of debt. China's debt-to-GDP ratio has soared to a staggering 345%, according to the Institute of International Finance, significantly worse than the United States, 123%, or Japan, 266%. Every year, China prints more fake growth to keep the economy afloat. But the debt is piling up faster than the economy is growing. It's like watching someone dig a hole to get out of a hole. The numbers will shock you. According to the Bank for International Settlements, China added $45 trillion in debt since 2008, equivalent to creating an economy the size of Germany every 2 years, but all on borrowed money. The game works like this. When the economy slows, the government orders banks to lend more money to build more things, mostly unnecessary infrastructure and empty housing. This creates jobs and boosts GDP statistics temporarily, but saddles the country with ever-increasing debt. It's like using one credit card to pay off another. It works until it doesn't. And when it finally stops working, the collapse will be spectacular. What's happening at the local level is even more alarming than the national crisis. 3. Local governments are bankrupt. China's local governments owe over $12.3 trillion, according to Goldman Sachs, and they've run out of ways to pay it back. For years, these governments relied on selling land to developers. But with the real estate market collapsing, that revenue stream has dried up. Land sales revenue plummeted by 38% in 2023, according to China's Ministry of Finance, the largest drop in a decade. The results are catastrophic. Cities can't pay salaries. Hospitals are running out of cash. In Hainan province, Government workers have seen their salaries cut by 50%. In others, public servants are being paid in groceries instead of money. The numbers are staggering. Local governments spent approximately $1.3 trillion on zero COVID measures in 2022 alone, according to the Financial Times. Money they simply didn't have. They're now sitting on debt equal to 76% of China's entire GDP. So where do desperate local governments turn when they need cash? To banks, of course. But China's banking system is hiding a secret that will leave you speechless. 4. Banking crisis. China's banks are sitting on a powder keg of bad loans that threatens to detonate the entire financial system. According to the Bank for International Settlements, non-performing loans in China are actually closer to 20% of GDP, about 10 times what official figures admit. That's $3.8 trillion in loans that will never be repaid, enough to bankrupt the entire banking system several times over. Meanwhile, legitimate small businesses can't access capital. The system is designed to keep the facade intact, not to create actual growth. Bank runs have already started in smaller regional banks. In Henan province, depositors found their life savings frozen, prompting rare public protests. When they tried to withdraw their money, their health QR codes mysteriously turned red, preventing them from traveling to bank branches. This might sound like conspiracy theory stuff, but it actually happened. The government literally used COVID tracking apps to stop people from withdrawing their money. If that doesn't terrify you, nothing will. People are losing faith in the system. When trust in banks evaporates, the financial system collapses. But there's an even more fundamental crisis threatening China's future. The country itself is disappearing at an alarming rate. 5. Population collapse. China's birth rate has fallen to a record low of 6.39 births per 1,000 people, according to China's National Bureau of Statistics, less than half the rate needed for population replacement. Despite abandoning the one-child policy, young Chinese couples simply aren't having babies. Housing costs are too high, education is too expensive, and work pressure is too intense. The truth is shocking. China's population declined by 1.39 million people in 2024 alone, marking the third consecutive year of decline, according to the National Bureau of Statistics. The rate of decline is accelerating, driven by the lasting effects of the one-child policy and rising economic pressures on families. By 2100, China's population could shrink to around 633 million, according to UN projections, less than half its current size. A shrinking population means fewer consumers, fewer workers, and fewer innovators. No economy can grow long-term with a rapidly declining population. It's basic math. And here's where things get truly terrifying. This population collapse isn't just a future problem. China's workforce is already vanishing at a rate that defies belief. 6. China's workforce collapse. China's working-age population peaked at 997 million in 2014 and has been shrinking ever since, according to Statista. By 2050, China will have 217 million fewer workers, according to the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, a drop larger than the entire U.S. workforce. By 2050, China will have more retirees than the entire population of the United States. These aren't projections from Western think tanks with an agenda. These are China's own numbers. China is facing the prospect of getting old before it gets rich, a demographic trap no major economy has successfully escaped. It's like trying to save for retirement after you've already retired. The most devastating part? The workforce collapse is hitting just as youth unemployment reaches crisis levels. 7. Unemployment nightmare. China's youth unemployment hit a staggering 21.3% in June 2024, according to Trading Economics. The situation became so embarrassing that Beijing simply stopped publishing the numbers. Tens of millions of college graduates can't find jobs matching their education. They've coined a term for themselves, full-time children, moving back in with parents after failing to launch careers. The numbers are jaw-dropping. In 2023, China produced 11.6 million college graduates, according to China's Ministry of Education. At current unemployment rates, about 2.5 million of them are jobless, creating a dangerous pool of educated, ambitious, and deeply frustrated young people. Throughout history, unemployed youth have been the kindling for political upheaval. The Arab Spring didn't start with middle-aged people complaining about politics. It started with young, educated people who couldn't find jobs. The social contract in China has always been simple: sacrifice political freedom for economic opportunity. But what happens when that economic opportunity disappears? The answer will reshape global politics for decades. But the worst part is yet to come. With so many unemployed young people, you'd expect China's manufacturing sector to be thriving. Instead, something unprecedented is happening that's sending shockwaves through the global economy. 8. Factories are leaving China. China was the world's factory, but companies are fleeing in droves at a pace that's hard to comprehend. Apple is aggressively shifting iPhone production to India, with plans to produce 25% of all iPhones in India by 2025, according to JP Morgan. Nike and Adidas have moved much of their manufacturing to Vietnam. U.S. imports from China dropped by 22% between 2022 and 2024, according to U.S. Census Bureau data. This exodus is happening for multiple reasons: rising labor costs as China's workforce shrinks, increasing government interference in business operations, growing fears about a potential conflict over Taiwan that could disrupt supply chains overnight. The numbers are brutal. Foreign direct investment in China plunged 80% in 2023, according to the State Administration of Foreign Exchange, reaching its lowest level since the 1990s. This isn't a blip. It's the beginning of a fundamental restructuring of global supply chains away from China. Once a company leaves, it rarely comes back. Each factory that relocates represents not just current job losses, but future opportunities that China will never see. The World Factory label made China rich. Losing it will make China poor. But that's nothing compared to what China did to its own tech sector. What comes next will make your jaw drop. 9. Tech collapse. For years, China's tech sector rivaled Silicon Valley. Companies like Alibaba, Tencent, and ByteDance appeared unstoppable. Then the government destroyed them in what might be the most spectacular act of economic self-sabotage in modern history. Xi Jinping feared tech giants had too much power, so he launched a brutal crackdown that wiped out over $1.5 trillion in market value from Chinese tech companies, according to Bloomberg. That's the equivalent of erasing the entire economies of Australia and New Zealand combined, overnight. Jack Ma, founder of Alibaba, vanished for months after criticizing government regulators. When he reappeared, his company was being dismantled. The gaming industry lost billions after strict regulations limited playing time for minors and froze new game approvals. China's AI and semiconductor development has been crippled by U.S. export controls. Despite pouring $50 billion into chip manufacturing, China remains 5 to 7 years behind Taiwan and the U.S., according to the Semiconductor Industry Association. In 2021, China ranked number 1 globally in tech IPOs. By 2023, Chinese tech IPOs had plunged 87%, according to data from Refinitiv. You can build the tech sector in decades, but you can destroy one in months. But all these economic problems pale in comparison to a much more fundamental threat, one that's literally drying up before our eyes. 10. Water crisis. China is running out of water, and the consequences are more severe than anyone wants to admit. According to China's Ministry of Ecology and Environment, 86% of groundwater in major agricultural regions is polluted, much of it too contaminated for any use. The Yellow River, which supports 160 million people, is drying up, losing 15% of its flow since the 1990s, according to research published in the Journal of Hydrology. The North China Plain, home to 400 million people, faces such severe water shortages that the World Resources Institute identifies it as one of the most water-stressed regions on Earth. Water tables are dropping by 3 feet per year, according to research published in Nature. Without water, China's farms and factories will grind to a halt. Cities will become unlivable. You can print money, but you can't print rainfall. The numbers are staggering. China has 20% of the world's population, but only 7% of its fresh water. 12 of China's 23 provinces face extreme water stress, according to the World Resources Institute. This isn't just an environmental issue. It's an existential threat to China's survival as a unified nation. And it leads directly to perhaps the most shocking vulnerability in China's entire system. 11. China can't feed itself. Despite all its economic power, China has a deadly secret. It cannot feed its own people. The country imports 85% of its soybeans, according to the USDA, 15% of its rice, and depends heavily on foreign food to survive. If a war, pandemic, or climate disaster disrupts these imports, China faces mass food shortages that would make empty grocery shelves during COVID look like a minor inconvenience. China's food imports have skyrocketed 1,000% since 2000, according to UN Comtrade data. The country spent $140 billion on imported food in 2023 alone, more than any other nation on Earth. Food security isn't just an economic issue, it's existential. Throughout Chinese history, dynasties have fallen when they've failed to feed the population. The Chinese Communist Party knows this well. It rose to power during a period of widespread hunger. A country that can't feed itself is perpetually vulnerable. No matter how many aircraft carriers China builds, it can't escape this basic reality. You can't eat aircraft carriers. And speaking of vulnerabilities, there's another resource crisis that keeps Chinese leaders awake at night. 12. Energy dependence. China depends heavily on foreign energy in ways that create critical strategic weaknesses. The country imports 73% of its oil, according to China's National Bureau of Statistics, much of it through sea lanes that could be easily disrupted in a conflict. China's Strategic Petroleum Reserve can only cover about 80 days of imports, according to the International Energy Agency, well below the 90-day minimum recommended for energy security. In a scenario where China faced a naval blockade, its economy would literally shut down within months. Factories would close, transportation would halt, cities would go dark. The numbers are alarming. China's oil import dependency has grown from 30% in 2000 to 73% today, according to China's National Energy Administration. Despite massive investments in renewable energy, China still gets 56% of its energy from coal, much of it imported. This vulnerability shapes China's military planning and foreign policy. It's why China has invested heavily in its navy and built artificial islands in the South China Sea. But the fundamental weakness remains. China needs energy imports to survive. All these economic and resource problems are creating something the Chinese government fears more than anything else. 13. Crime and social unrest. As economic pressures mount social stability, the Chinese government's highest priority is fraying in ways that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. According to the China Labor Bulletin, protests and labor disputes increased by 30% in 2023 compared to 2022. Workers riot over unpaid wages. Homeowners demonstrate when their half-built apartments are abandoned. The middle class protest when their bank deposits are frozen. What's truly shocking, according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, China spends $216 billion on internal security compared to $209 billion on its military. That's right, China spends more money controlling its own people than it does preparing for external threats. In Xinjiang province alone, China has detained over 1 million Uyghurs, according to UN estimates. Ethnic tensions simmer beneath the surface in Tibet, Inner Mongolia, and other regions. The social contract that maintained stability for decades, economic growth in exchange for political compliance, is breaking down as the economy falters. And when that social contract fully dissolves, the consequences will reshape global politics. But China's problems aren't just domestic. Its ambitious plan to dominate the global economy is facing a catastrophic failure that will leave you stunned. 14. Belt and road failure. China's Belt and Road Initiative was supposed to be Xi Jinping's legacy, a global infrastructure network extending Chinese influence across continents. Instead, it's becoming a financial disaster of historic proportions. Partner countries are defaulting on Chinese loans, leaving China with trillions in unpaid debts, according to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. The numbers are staggering. China has lent over $1 trillion to more than 150 countries, much of it to nations that can't possibly repay. Sri Lanka couldn't repay its loans and was forced to hand over a strategic port to China for 99 years. Pakistan, one of China's closest allies, has repeatedly asked to restructure its Chinese debt. Over 40% of Pakistan's external debt is owed to China, according to the World Bank. According to research from aid data, 42 countries now have debt exposure to China exceeding 10% of their GDP. Many of these loans were made with predatory terms, including collateral requirements that let China seize assets when countries default. What was meant to expand China's power has instead drained its resources and generated resentment. Belt and Road countries increasingly view China as a predatory lender, not a benevolent partner. But China's global strategy isn't the only thing failing. Its core economic engine, exports, is sputtering in ways that threaten the entire system. 15. Collapsing exports and trade war pressure. China's once booming exports are under unprecedented pressure from all sides. According to the Peterson Institute for International Economics, U.S. tariffs now cover 66.4% of Chinese imports, up from just 7.5% in 2018. The European Union has imposed anti-dumping duties on everything from electric vehicles to solar panels. India and Vietnam are rapidly replacing China in key manufacturing sectors. Vietnam's exports to the U.S. have grown by 180% since 2018, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. India has overtaken China as the world's fastest-growing major economy. China's trade surplus fell by 30% in the first half of 2024 compared to the same period in 2023, according to data from China's General Administration of Customs. Chinese exports to the U.S. have fallen from $540 billion in 2018 to $427 billion in 2023, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. China built its economy on exports. Now the world is moving on, and there's no plan B. But if all these economic, demographic, and resource problems weren't enough, China faces another threat that might be the most dangerous of all. 16. Xi Jinping's total control. Xi Jinping has eliminated rivals and consolidated more power than any Chinese leader since Mao Zedong, making China effectively a one-man dictatorship. This might sound like strength, but it's actually China's greatest vulnerability. When all decisions flow through one person, the system becomes brittle. Subordinates fear delivering bad news. Alternative viewpoints are suppressed. Reality itself becomes distorted as it travels up the chain of command. According to the Congressional Research Service, Xi holds at least 12 top leadership positions, giving him unprecedented control over the party, state, and military. He's extended his rule indefinitely, removing the term limits that ensured regular leadership transitions. The consequences are dire. Economic policy blunders like the tech crackdown and zero COVID devastated China's economy. According to the World Bank, zero COVID alone cost China $4 trillion in lost economic output, all because no one could tell Xi it wasn't working. But this creates a dangerous dynamic. When everything is your decision, everything is your fault. As China's problems multiply, there's no one left to blame but Xi himself. And now for perhaps the most surprising fact of all, one that completely contradicts China's carefully cultivated image as a military superpower. 17. Military failures. Despite its impressive military parades and growing defense budget, China's military has a fatal flaw. It has never fought a modern war. The People's Liberation Army hasn't engaged in large-scale combat since a brief border war with Vietnam in 1979, and that didn't go well for China. Today's PLA officers have risen through the ranks based on political loyalty, not battlefield experience. Corruption remains rampant in the military despite purges and crackdowns. According to a RAND Corporation study, paid promotions, embezzlement, and kickbacks from defense contractors continue to undermine readiness. In 2022 alone, more than 60 senior military officers were investigated for corruption, according to China's Central Military Commission. Chinese soldiers lack real combat experience and train in highly scripted exercises designed to look good for political leaders rather than develop actual fighting capabilities. According to the U.S. Department of Defense's annual report to Congress, China's military training remains focused on choreographed demonstrations rather than realistic combat scenarios. Even China's growing naval power, often cited as evidence of its rising threat, has never been tested in combat conditions. Building ships is one thing, operating them effectively under fire is quite another. This military inexperience becomes especially concerning when you consider how these other 16 crises might push China's leadership toward a conflict as a distraction from domestic problems. History shows that failing regimes often look outward for enemies when facing collapse at home, and rarely has a major power faced so many simultaneous crises as China does today. The cracks in China's facade aren't just appearing, they're spreading rapidly across every sector of society and economy. From ghost cities to rivers running dry, from banks hiding bad loans to factories fleeing overseas, these aren't isolated problems that can be fixed with a 5-year plan. The China we thought we knew, the economic juggernaut destined to overtake America, was built on unsustainable foundations. The real estate bubble, demographic collapse, debt crisis, water shortages, and technological setbacks aren't separate challenges. They're interconnected failures in a system that's reaching its breaking point. History teaches us that no economic miracle lasts forever. The Soviet Union appeared unstoppable until it collapsed virtually overnight. Japan seemed destined to dominate the global economy until its bubble burst in the 1990s. China's trajectory may prove no different, except the scale of its problems dwarfs anything we've seen before. The implications stretch far beyond China's borders. Global supply chains, financial markets, and geopolitical alignments would all be transformed by China's decline. The question isn't whether China faces serious problems, the evidence is overwhelming that it does. The real question is how rapidly these crises will accelerate, and what that means for global stability. What do you think? Which of these facts shocked you the most? Can China somehow overcome these challenges, or are we witnessing the early stages of a historic collapse? Let us know in the comments below. Now go check out China's collapse into poverty is worse than you think, or click this other video instead. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn that notification bell on so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos.
The year is 2035. China's gleaming skyscrapers are half empty. Its ghost cities, once symbols of unstoppable growth, are crumbling. And that massive middle class that was supposed to power China's future, they're watching their savings disappear as property values collapse. Sounds crazy, right? After all, this is China we're talking about, the economic miracle that lifted 800 million people out of poverty, the country that built entire cities in months and became the world's factory floor. But here's the thing, China's miracle is running out of magic. And what's happening now isn't just a slowdown, it's the beginning of something much worse. We're watching the world's second largest economy start a long, painful slide back into poverty. Don't believe it? Let me show you why China's future looks a lot more like its past than anyone wants to admit. Let's start with something that would have seemed impossible just a few years ago. China's real estate market, worth a staggering $50 trillion, is imploding. We're not talking about a minor correction here. This is a full-blown crisis that's erasing decades of wealth creation. Think about this. China has enough empty apartments to house 3 billion people. That's not a typo, 3 billion. Remember, China's total population is only 1.4 billion. They've literally built enough homes to house an extra China, and then some. But here's where it gets really wild. Meet Zhang Wei, a 35-year-old software engineer from Shenzhen. Back in 2020, he and his wife spent their life savings on a $400,000 apartment. They thought it was a safe investment. After all, Chinese property values had only gone up for decades. Now, that apartment's worth half what they paid. And they're not alone. Across China, middle-class families are watching their wealth evaporate. The numbers are staggering. In just the past 2 years, Chinese property prices have dropped by 30% in some cities. In places like Dongguan, once a booming tech hub, entire neighborhoods sit empty. Local real estate agents say they haven't made a sale in months. Remember Evergrande? It used to be China's biggest property developer. Now it's defaulted on over $300 billion in debt. But here's the scary part. Evergrande isn't the only one. Country Garden, another massive developer, just defaulted on $187 billion. Together, China's property developers owe more money than the entire GDP of France. And it's not just the big developers. The whole system is built on a house of cards. Chinese families have 70% of their wealth tied up in real estate, compared to just 35% in the United States. When property values fall, they don't just lose a little money, they lose everything. But the real estate crisis isn't just about money, it's about trust. See, Chinese developers had this crazy business model. They'd sell apartments before they were built, using the money from new buyers to finish projects for old buyers. It worked great as long as prices kept rising. But now, there are over 20 million pre-sold apartments that might never get finished. Imagine saving for years, finally buying your dream home, and then nothing. The construction stops, the developer disappears, your life savings are gone. That's happening to millions of Chinese families right now. And here's the kicker. Local governments are in on this too. They've been funding themselves by selling land to developers. With the property market frozen, their revenue has collapsed. Some cities have cut civil servant salaries. Others can't afford to maintain basic services. But that's just the beginning of China's problems. Because while everyone's been focused on those empty apartments, something even more dangerous has been happening. China's been losing its edge as the world's factory floor. Wait until you hear what's happening to China's manufacturing sector and why companies are racing to move their factories to places like Vietnam and Mexico. But first, we need to talk about the man who's accelerating China's decline and how this obsession with control is strangling the world's second largest economy. Meet Xi Jinping, the leader who's managed to do what decades of Western sanctions couldn't: cripple China's economic future. And he's done it in ways that would make Mao proud. Remember how China used to work? Local officials had the freedom to experiment with policies. Foreign investors were welcomed with open arms, and China's government mostly stayed out of private business. This system wasn't perfect, but it turned China into an economic powerhouse. Xi changed all that. Since taking power, he's rewired China's entire economy around a single principle: control. And I mean control of everything. Take Jack Ma, for example. He built Alibaba into China's Amazon and was worth over $800 billion. Then he made one speech criticizing financial regulators. What happened next? His company's IPO got canceled overnight. Regulators launched investigations, and he basically disappeared for months. Alibaba's value? It dropped by $400 billion. That's more than the entire value of Walmart, gone because one businessman spoke out of turn. And it gets worse. In 2023, Xi introduced an anti-espionage law so broad that even basic market research could get you arrested. Want to know how many gadgets a factory produces? Could be espionage. Want to survey Chinese consumers about their shopping habits? Might be a national security threat. The results were predictable. Foreign companies started pulling out. In 2023 alone, foreign investment in China dropped by 80%. Just let that sink in. Businesses would rather give up on the world's biggest market than deal with Xi's rules. But here's where Xi's really outdone himself.
He's concentrated so much power in his own hands that even China's central bank needs his approval for major decisions. Remember how local officials used to have freedom to experiment? Now they're so scared of making mistakes that they won't make any decisions at all. This might sound like just political stuff, but it's having real economic impacts. Let me show you what I mean. In 2023, China reported 5.2% GDP growth. Look at this chart from the World Economic Forum. See how they're projecting growth to slow even further? But even these numbers don't tell the whole story. The government celebrated their 5.2% like it was proof their system was working. Western media outlets ran headlines about China's robust recovery. Even the IMF praised China's strong comeback. But here's what they're not telling you. China had to invest 40% of its entire GDP, twice what the US invests, just to get that growth. The numbers are brutal. China dumps $40 into the economy just to get $100 of growth. That's not an economy, that's a money pit. Want to see how crazy this gets? Let's look at just one example: high-speed rail. China's built 40,000 kilometers of high-speed rail lines, more than every other country in the world combined. Sounds impressive, right? But here's the catch: 80% of these lines lose money. The railway system's total debt? $900 billion. Some lines generate so little revenue they can't even afford their electricity bills. Or take the city of Tianjin. They spent $47 billion to build a world-class financial center. Today, most of the buildings are empty. The few companies that moved in are mostly state-owned enterprises forced to be there. It's like building a massive shopping mall in the middle of nowhere and then forcing government stores to open there. This isn't just happening in one city. Across China, local governments have built airports that never see planes, stadiums that never host games, and museums that never open. They're building stuff just to boost GDP numbers. Youth unemployment got so bad that China stopped publishing the numbers. It got so bad they just stopped releasing the numbers altogether. And remember those tech companies we talked about? The ones Xi cracked down on? In 2021 alone, his policies destroyed more value than the entire GDP of France. Hundreds of thousands of high-paying tech jobs vanished. Some of China's brightest minds, the people who were supposed to drive innovation and future growth, are now driving delivery bikes or selling street food. Here's why this matters. China's old model of growth, building stuff and exporting cheap goods, isn't working anymore. They need to shift to a consumer-driven economy like every other developed nation. But Xi's policies are doing the exact opposite. He's scaring away investors, crushing private business, and making it harder for regular Chinese people to make money. But if you think that's bad, wait until you see what's happening to China's local governments. Because while Beijing might be putting on a brave face, China's provinces are facing a financial crisis that makes America's 2008 meltdown look like a minor hiccup. Here's the thing about China's local governments. They've been running a giant pyramid scheme for decades. They'd buy land cheap from farmers, sell it expensive to developers, and use that money to fund everything from schools to subways. In good times, land sales provided up to 40% of their revenue. But remember those property developers we talked about? The ones going bankrupt? Well, they're not buying land anymore. And when nobody's buying land, local governments stop making money. It's that simple. Let me show you how bad this has gotten. In Henan province, civil servants had their salaries cut by 50%. In Guangdong, China's richest province, government workers are being forced to take pay cuts of up to 30%. Some cities can't even afford to keep their streetlights on at night. Take the city of Tianjin again. They're so desperate for money, they're selling off government buildings. The local government literally can't afford its own offices anymore. And they're one of the wealthy cities. Imagine how bad things are in poorer regions. But here's where it gets really scary. Chinese local governments have racked up $9 trillion in hidden debt. That's bigger than the economies of Japan and Germany combined. They used something called local government financing vehicles, basically special companies that could borrow money without it showing up on official books. Now these LGFVs, as they're called, are starting to default. In 2023, a financing vehicle in Yunnan province missed a payment on its bonds. It was the first default of its kind in China's history, but it won't be the last. Remember those basic services governments are supposed to provide? Schools, hospitals, road maintenance? Local governments are cutting back on all of that. And it's creating a dangerous feedback loop. When local governments cut spending, people lose jobs. When people lose jobs, they stop buying houses. When nobody buys houses, property prices fall more. When property prices fall, local governments make even less money from land sales, and round we go. But here's the real kicker. China's central government can't just bail everyone out. They've got their own problems. Between COVID spending, military buildups, and trying to prop up the economy, Beijing's coffers aren't as full as they used to be. You might be thinking, okay, but China still makes everything, right? They're still the world's factory floor? Well, about that. Because what's happening in China's manufacturing sector might be the biggest sign yet that China's heading back to poverty. Remember when Made in China was on everything you owned? Those days are ending. Let me show you why. Take Apple. They've been making iPhones in China since 2007. But in 2023, something remarkable happened. They started moving production to India. Not just a little bit either. By 2025, 25% of all iPhones will be made in India. That's a $50 billion shift away from China. And Apple isn't alone. Samsung, they've already left, moving their factories to Vietnam. Nike, they're making more shoes in Vietnam than China now. Even Chinese companies are getting out. BYD, China's biggest electric car maker, is building factories in Mexico and Thailand. The numbers are staggering. In 2023 alone, foreign companies announced 378 major factory relocations out of China. Vietnam's exports to the U.S. have tripled since 2018. Mexico's manufacturing sector is growing at its fastest rate in decades. Meanwhile, China's share of global exports has dropped for the first time in 40 years. But why is this happening? Well, it's not just one thing, it's a perfect storm. First, Chinese workers aren't cheap anymore. Average factory wages have tripled in the last decade. A factory worker in Vietnam cost half as much. In India, it's even less. Remember how China got rich by being the world's low-cost manufacturer? That advantage is gone. Second, Xi's policies have scared companies away. Remember that anti-espionage law we talked about? Well, imagine trying to run a factory when checking your own production numbers might be considered spying. Companies are tired of dealing with it. Third, China's population is aging fast. The number of working-age people in China has dropped by 40 million since 2012. That's like losing the entire workforce of Spain. And it's getting worse. China's workforce is shrinking by 3 million people every year. But here's what really keeps manufacturing executives up at night: the growing tension between China and the West. Companies learned a hard lesson during COVID. Depending too much on China is risky. Now, with talk of trade wars and sanctions, they're not taking chances. Look at what happened to China's semiconductor industry. In 2022, the U.S. banned the sale of advanced chip-making equipment to China. Overnight, China's plans to dominate the semiconductor industry were set back by years. Their most advanced chips are now 3 generations behind Taiwan's. The impact on Chinese workers has been devastating. In Dongguan, once known as the world's factory, thousands of factories have closed. The city's population has dropped by 10% as workers leave to find jobs elsewhere. Similar stories are playing out across China's manufacturing belt. And this isn't just about factory jobs. It's about the entire ecosystem of businesses that grew up around manufacturing. The restaurants that fed workers, the shops that sold them goods, the apartments they rented, all of that is starting to collapse. But if you think this manufacturing exodus is bad, wait until you hear about China's demographic nightmare. Because while factories can move back someday, China's population problem is about to make poverty inevitable. And when I say inevitable, I mean it's already happening. Here's a number that should terrify Xi Jinping. For every 17 people who die in China today, only 10 babies are being born. China's population isn't just shrinking, it's collapsing.
In 2023 alone, China lost 2 million people. That's like losing the entire population of Slovenia in just 1 year. But it gets worse, much worse. By 2035, that's just 11 years from now, 1 in 3 Chinese people will be over 60. That means 400 million elderly people who need pensions, healthcare, and support. For comparison, that's more senior citizens than the entire population of the United States. But wait, you might be thinking, don't they have young people to support the elderly? Well, that's where things get really interesting. And by interesting, I mean catastrophic. Remember that one-child policy China had for decades? Well, they're paying the price now. A typical family structure in China looks like this: 2 parents, 4 grandparents, and just 1 child. They call them 4-to-1 families. That 1 child is supposed to support 6 older people. It's mathematically impossible. And those young people, they're struggling. Let me show you something fascinating. And by fascinating, I mean terrifying. This graph tells the story better than I ever could. See that sharp line going up? That's China's urban youth unemployment rate. It hit a staggering 21.3% in June 2023, and then the line just stops. Why? Because China simply stopped publishing the numbers. They claimed they needed to improve their statistical methodology. Right, more like they needed to figure out how to make terrible numbers look less terrible. Independent estimates suggest the real rate is now closer to 30%. Even after they resumed reporting with their new methodology in December 2023, they somehow claimed unemployment had magically dropped to 14.9%. But here's the thing, they changed who counts as unemployed youth. Convenient, isn't it? Take Lu Ming, a 24-year-old engineering graduate in Shanghai. He's been looking for work for 8 months. His parents spent their savings on his education, hoping he'd support them in retirement. Instead, he's delivering food on an electric scooter, making barely enough to support himself. China's pension system is already cracking under the pressure. In 2022, 14 provinces reported pension shortfalls. By 2035, China's pension system will need an extra $300 billion every year just to stay afloat. That's more than China's entire military budget. But here's where demography becomes destiny. Remember how China got rich? Cheap labor. Lots of young workers willing to work in factories for low wages. In the 1980s, 8 working-age Chinese supported each retiree. Today, it's 4. By 2035, it'll be 2. That's not an economy that can support itself, let alone compete globally. And China can't immigrate its way out of this problem. Unlike America, which can attract talented people from around the world, China's strict controls and growing xenophobia make it an unattractive destination for immigrants. Instead, China's losing its best and brightest. In 2023, applications for emigration hit record highs. The wealthy are sending their kids abroad and moving their money with them. It's a brain drain and a capital drain happening at the same time. Think this is just a future problem? Think again. Because what's happening to China's social contract right now might be the biggest sign yet that poverty isn't just coming. It's already here. See, China's government had a deal with its people. It went something like this: give up political freedom, get economic prosperity in return. For 40 years, the deal worked. People got richer, lives got better, everyone was happy, or at least happy enough. But now, that deal is falling apart faster than a Chinese apartment building. Remember Zhang Wei, our software engineer from earlier? His parents lived through real poverty in the 1970s. They accepted authoritarian rule because their lives kept improving. Zhang accepted it because he thought he'd do even better than his parents. Instead, he's watching his property value collapse. His tech sector job is insecure. His savings are worth less every day as the yuan weakens. And now he's wondering, what exactly is he giving up his freedom for? He's not alone. Across China, people are asking the same question. Young people call it lying flat, giving up on the rat race because they can't win anyway. They're refusing to buy homes, have kids, or work overtime. Some are even refusing to work at all. The numbers tell the story. China's manufacturing output is shrinking. Foreign investment is fleeing. The property market is in free fall. And consumer confidence? it's hit historic lows. Marriage rates have plunged 60% in the last decade. Birth rates have collapsed. People aren't just worried about the future, they're giving up on it. And Xi Jinping knows it. That's why he's doubling down on control. More surveillance, more censorship, more nationalism. He's trying to replace the economic dream with a political one, the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. But you can't eat nationalism. You can't live in it. You can't save it for retirement. This is how China becomes poor again, not with a bang, but with a whimper. Property values fall, factories leave, young people give up, old people run out of savings, local governments can't provide services, the middle class disappears. It's already happening. In 2023, the number of Chinese billionaires dropped by more than half. The middle class is shrinking for the first time since reforms began. Rural parents are pulling kids out of school because they can't afford tuition. This isn't just a crisis, it's the end of an era. The Chinese miracle is over. The economic model that lifted 800 million people out of poverty, it's broken, and there's no fixing it. Think about what that means for a second. The world's second largest economy, home to 1.4 billion people, is sliding back into poverty. Not because of war, not because of natural disasters, but because the very things that made China rich are now making it poor. The real estate bubble that created wealth is now destroying it. The demographic dividend that powered growth has turned into a demographic disaster. The authoritarian system that enabled rapid development is now strangling innovation. So what happens next? Well, that's where things get really interesting and scary. Because China's not going to get poor alone. When the world's second largest economy tanks, everyone feels it. Those supply chains you rely on, they're going to break. The cheap stuff at Walmart, it's going to get expensive. Those treasury bonds China owns, they might have to sell them. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories shaping our world. China's economy isn't just pathetic, it's collapsing, fast, loud, and in full view of the world. The unstoppable superpower we were told would dominate the 21st century, it's crumbling from the inside out. Ghost cities, sky-high youth unemployment, a shrinking, aging population, and now a housing market so broken that over 90 million homes sit completely empty, enough to house the entire population of Spain. This isn't a slowdown. It's the spectacular unraveling of a $52 trillion inventory bubble, built not on value but on debt, hype, and deception. At 3:25 p.m. on August 27, 2021, 15 high-rise towers in Kunming were reduced to rubble in a perfectly synchronized explosion. No war, no natural disaster, just buildings no one ever needed, collapsing under the weight of their own uselessness. It wasn't just a demolition, it was a preview. So how did China go from economic miracle to real estate graveyard? First up, the bubble that changed everything. China's real estate sector accounts for nearly 30% of its entire GDP, according to the International Monetary Fund's 2023 country report. Almost a third of their economy is tied to building apartments and commercial properties. But here's where things get alarming. Housing prices have plummeted since 2019 with no bottom in sight, according to Reuters data. Major developers like Evergrande and Country Garden have collapsed under hundreds of billions in debt. Unlike Americans who invest in stocks or retirement funds, about 70% of Chinese household wealth is tied up in property, according to a 2023 survey by China's National Bureau of Statistics. When housing prices fall, families don't just lose investments, they lose everything. In cities like Shaoguan, entire districts sit half-finished and eerily uninhabited, a stark symbol of China's unraveling real estate crisis. This isn't just a correction, it's a $133 trillion property market cracking under its own weight. The property crisis has sparked unprecedented resistance. In over 100 cities, home buyers have launched mortgage boycotts, refusing to pay loans on unfinished properties. Social media footage shows crowds chanting "Return our money" outside bank headquarters. And this public discontent coincides with the shocking revelation that undermines China's entire economic narrative. China lied about its population.
not by thousands or millions, but by over 130 million people. According to Professor Yi Fushuan, a leading expert on Chinese demographics, the government has been overestimating its population by at least 10%. That's the equivalent of inventing an entire country the size of Japan. Why? Because bigger population numbers made China look stronger and more productive on the global stage. It artificially lowered their GDP per capita while making their military power appear greater. China wanted to project strength, says Yi. Artificially inflated population figures made their economic miracle seem more miraculous. The truth is now emerging. In 2022, China announced its first population decline in 60 years. But according to Yi's research, the decline actually began in 2018, 4 years earlier than officially admitted. What's worse, China's birth rate has now fallen below Japan's, a country famously struggling with demographic decline. Recent data from Statista shows China recorded just 6.77 births per 1,000 people in 2024, nearly 50% below replacement level. But wait, didn't China end its infamous one-child policy years ago? They did, in 2016, but the expected baby boom never materialized. Young Chinese couples looked at sky-high housing costs, brutal work hours, and expensive education requirements and simply said, no thanks. The government's desperate measures, from baby bonuses of up to 10,000 won to propaganda campaigns with slogans like marriage and reproduction are family responsibilities, have failed to reverse the trend. According to projections from Visual Capitalist, China's population could shrink by half by 2100, dropping from 1.41 billion to around 600 million. That's equivalent to losing the entire population of North America. The Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences put it bluntly in their 2023 report. China's demographic collapse is not a future event, but a present reality. This isn't just a statistical curiosity, it's an economic death sentence. The irony is brutal. China spent decades enforcing a policy to have fewer babies, and it worked so well that now, even when they're begging citizens to have children, nobody's listening. As one Chinese demographer told the Taipei Times, the one-child policy fundamentally altered the cultural understanding of family size. You can undo that with policy changes. China's working-age population peaked in 2015 and has been shrinking for nearly a decade. By 2050, China will have 200 million fewer workers, more than the entire U.S. workforce. This workforce collapse is creating labor shortages that undermine China's competitive advantage. Factory owners in Guangdong and Zhejiang provinces report raising wages by 30 to 40% just to attract workers, destroying China's edge as a low-cost manufacturer. The demographic crisis creates a perfect storm. China is getting old before getting rich. Currently, about 14% of China's population is over 65. By 2040, that will nearly double to 30%, almost 1 in 3 people. A country with more grandparents than workers faces an impossible economic equation. According to a 2023 report from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, China's main pension fund will run out of money by 2035. Xi Jinping himself acknowledged this in a rare moment of candor, reportedly calling the demographic situation the most significant hidden danger to national security. The social contract that has kept China stable, rapid economic growth in exchange for political compliance, is breaking down. Who will staff the factories, buy the apartments, or pay for the health care and pensions of hundreds of millions of elderly Chinese? As if the property collapse and demographic crisis weren't enough, China's economic model faces a third existential threat: debt. China's overall debt has now surged past 300% of GDP, according to 2024 figures reported by the Economic Times. For comparison, the United States, hardly a model of fiscal restraint, hovers around 120%. The economic growth that impressed the world wasn't built on innovation or productivity. It was built on borrowing. Every time growth slowed, the government ordered more construction, more apartments nobody would live in, more infrastructure nobody needed, more factories with no orders. Former Chinese Finance Minister Liu Jiwei acknowledged this reality in a speech at Tsinghua University. Our economic growth has been primarily driven by investment, not by productivity or innovation. This model has reached its limits. Local governments are the canaries in this coal mine. Collectively owing over $9 trillion in debt, they've relied on selling land to developers as their primary revenue source. With the real estate market collapsing, that revenue has disappeared. The desperation is palpable. The city of Nanning sold police cars. Tianjin auctioned government furniture. Henan province tried forcing civil servants to buy unsold apartments. According to Economic Times, some cities can't pay salaries, while others are paying workers in groceries instead of money. Banking expert Michael Pettis from Peking University notes, the debt situation at local levels is far worse than officially reported. Many liabilities are kept off the books through local government financing vehicles. The debt crisis coincides with record youth unemployment that Beijing can no longer hide. Youth unemployment hit 21.3% in June 2023, a figure so alarming that China's National Bureau of Statistics suspended reporting it while they improved their methodology. When reporting resumed, the rate still hovered at 18.8% in August 2024 before dropping slightly to 17.6% in September. That's 1 in 5 young Chinese unable to find work in what was supposed to be the world's economic powerhouse. College graduates are calling themselves full-time children, moving back in with their parents. Others describe lying flat, giving up on career ambitions entirely. As one recent graduate told the BBC, "I studied so hard to get a good degree, but there's no future. I've sent out hundreds of applications and heard nothing back. What's the point anymore?" This generation has coined a new term for themselves, rotten tail kids, drawing a parallel to the unfinished rotten tail buildings dotting China's landscape. They spend 16-hour days studying for civil service exams where 1.5 million applicants compete for just 37,000 government jobs, odds of just 2%. As young people lose hope, global companies are fleeing China in what economists call the Great Decoupling. Foreign direct investment continues to slide, with global manufacturers accelerating their pivot away from China. Chip makers like Intel, Infineon Technologies, and Micron Technology have poured billions into new facilities in Malaysia and Singapore. HP has expanded its laptop assembly operations in Thailand over the past 3 years, while factories in Malaysia's Penang state now produce cutting-edge AI servers. As a result, Malaysian exports of semiconductors, computers, and other electronics hit a record $137 billion in 2024, with the surge in shipments to the U.S. Meanwhile, China's dominance in notebook production is beginning to erode after accounting for nearly all global output just a few years ago. Its share is projected to fall to 80% in 2025 as Vietnam and Thailand pick up production. This shift marks more than just a supply chain adjustment. Companies that spent decades building their presence in China are now scrambling to get out, says economist Mary Lovely of the Peterson Institute. We're witnessing the most dramatic industrial migration in modern history. Why this exodus? Rising labor costs without rising productivity, arbitrary regulatory crackdowns, intellectual property theft, and a consumer market that's shrinking instead of growing. China's tech sector, once the crown jewel of its economic ascent, has been severely impacted by government interventions. In 2021, a sweeping regulatory crackdown led to a loss of over $1 trillion in market value among major tech firms. Jack Ma, the founder of Alibaba, notably vanished from public view for months after criticizing financial regulators. Even foreign tech companies weren't spared. LinkedIn and Yahoo both withdrew from China that year, citing escalating compliance costs and an increasingly challenging operating environment. This aggressive stance signaled a clear message: political control takes precedence over economic growth. Consequently, venture capital investment in Chinese tech firms has plummeted by 87% from its 2018 peak. These developments underscore a deeper issue: the faltering of China's ambitious Made in China 2025 initiative. Launched in 2015, the plan aimed to transform China into a global leader in high-tech industries, reducing its reliance on foreign technology. However, studies indicate that while the initiative funneled substantial subsidies into targeted firms, it failed to produce significant improvements in productivity, R&D expenditure, or patent output. One of the most high-profile targets was the electric vehicle sector. Despite pouring over $100 billion into the industry and spawning more than 300 EV manufacturers, China's auto sector still depends heavily on foreign core technologies. In response, the government has quietly pressured firms like BYD and Geely to ramp up purchases from domestic chip makers, a telling sign of how far China remains from achieving technological self-sufficiency. The Semiconductor Initiative is even more revealing. The Big Fund, China's $50 billion semiconductor investment vehicle, has yielded disappointing results. In 2023, several of its executives were arrested for corruption. HSMC, once touted as a homegrown chip-making giant, collapsed after burning through billions. Meanwhile, China's most advanced chip producer, SMIC, remains stuck at 7-nanometer technology, while global leaders have already moved on to 3-nanometer and beyond. This technological dependence creates an existential vulnerability. When the United States restricted high-end chip exports to China in 2022, it effectively capped China's AI development, military modernization, and high-tech manufacturing ambitions. China's innovation model fundamentally misunderstands how technology advances, explains Dr. William Hannes of Georgetown University. They've emphasized massive capital investments and targeted goals, but innovation requires an ecosystem of intellectual freedom, risk-taking, and failure tolerance that China's system actively suppresses. Equally concerning is China's shadow banking crisis that threatens to detonate at any moment. Behind the official banking system lies a $3 trillion shadow banking sector, a complex web of wealth management products, trust companies, and off-balance sheet loans. This parallel financial system helped fuel China's growth but created massive hidden risks. In 2023, Zhongxi Enterprise Group, managing over $140 billion in assets, suddenly announced it was insolvent. Country Garden, once China's largest developer, defaulted on overseas debt. Both events sent shockwaves through China's financial system. More alarming are the bank runs that rarely make international headlines. In 2024, depositors lined up outside rural banks in Henan province after discovering their deposits, totaling $6 billion, had vanished. When they protested, local authorities manipulated their COVID health codes to restrict their movement, turning public health tools into instruments of financial repression. China's financial system is built on implicit guarantees that the government will never allow significant losses, notes Logan Wright of Rhodium Group, but as more defaults occur, that confidence is eroding rapidly. The real warning sign came in July 2024, not from a collapse, but from a historic plunge in bond yields. As money fled China's collapsing real estate market and volatile stock exchanges, investors piled into government bonds, sending prices soaring and yields to record lows. The benchmark 10-year bond yield fell to just 2.18%, its lowest level since records began in 2002. This rush into perceived safety reveals a deep lack of confidence in the broader financial system. These financial tremors expose another critical weakness: the widening divide between China's prosperous coastal regions and its struggling interior. The gleaming skylines of Shanghai and Shenzhen mask a stark reality. Much of China remains poor, with regional inequalities worse than any other major economy. The per capita GDP of Jiangsu province is 3 times higher than that of Gansu. This disparity has worsened over the past decade. The COVID pandemic exacerbated these divisions. While coastal tech hubs recovered quickly, interior manufacturing regions dependent on exports struggled to keep pace. In 2023, Yunnan province grew by just 4.4%, well below the pace of leading coastal cities. Beijing, by contrast, posted a stronger recovery with GDP growth exceeding 5%. This regional inequality creates dangerous political tensions. In 2023, protests erupted in Wuhan, where COVID first emerged, not over health resources, but in response to signals from Beijing that it would not bail out debt-laden local governments. The demonstration reflected growing frustration with the financial fallout of China's strict zero-COVID policies and the widening gap between struggling interior regions and wealthier coastal cities. In resource-rich Inner Mongolia, resentment continues to build as locals watch their coal and rare earth minerals fuel Beijing's economy, while environmental degradation remains local. China isn't one economy but several different economies moving at different speeds, explains economist Barry Naughton of UC San Diego. The coastal innovation economy, the interior manufacturing economy, and the Western resource economy are diverging rather than converging. This fragmentation undermines Beijing's ability to implement coherent economic policies. Stimulus meant for productive investment often gets captured by wealthy coastal provinces, while austerity measures hit the interior hardest, further widening disparities. But perhaps nowhere is China's economic mismanagement more evident than in its environmental crisis. Why should you care about China's problems? Because when the world's second-largest economy unravels, the shock waves will hit every corner of the globe. China is the largest trading partner for over 120 countries. It controls 85% of global rare earth processing, manufactures 80% of the world's solar panels, and produces 76% of its lithium-ion batteries. China's economic problems represent the single largest threat to global economic stability today, warns former U.S. Treasury Secretary Larry Summers. Next, global shipping and commodities markets will convulse. The Baltic Dry Index, measuring global shipping costs, has already dropped 37% since January 2023 as Chinese imports decline. Iron ore, copper, and coal prices would crash, devastating resource-dependent economies from Australia to Brazil. Manufacturing supply chains will fracture by the third quarter of 2025. Companies dependent on Chinese components will face critical shortages. Inventories of high-tech components have already fallen to alarming levels. By early 2026, financial contagion will spread as Chinese investors liquidate overseas assets to cover domestic losses. Hong Kong's property market would likely collapse first, followed by luxury real estate in Vancouver, Sydney, and London, markets where Chinese investors have been major buyers. We'd see a cascade of deleveraging that would make 2008 look orderly by comparison, explains economist Stephen Roach, former chairman of Morgan Stanley Asia. The healthcare sector faces unique vulnerabilities. China produces 80% of the world's active pharmaceutical ingredients. A sustained disruption could trigger global medication shortages within 120 days. The FDA has already identified 63 critical medications that would be affected. European economies face particular exposure. Germany sells 33% of its automobiles to China. French luxury conglomerates derive 35% of their profits from Chinese consumers. Italy's high-end fashion houses count on Chinese tourists for 20% of European sales. Then, manufacturing supply chains would break. Everything from smartphones to automobiles requires components made in China, components that might suddenly become unavailable. Financial markets would follow. Chinese investors desperate for cash would sell foreign assets, triggering market crashes from Asia first, then Europe and America. The $61 trillion in Chinese bank assets, many of dubious quality, would be called into question, potentially freezing global interbank lending. But what's truly terrifying about this situation is how the Chinese government might respond to economic collapse. History shows that when authoritarian regimes face internal crises, they often look for external enemies to blame. There's a direct correlation between China's internal economic stress and its external belligerence, explains Dr. Elizabeth Economy of the Hoover Institution. China's increasing military aggression and threats against Taiwan aren't happening in a vacuum. They're the desperate actions of a regime that knows its economic narrative is collapsing. The warning signs are already visible. Naval encounters in the South China Sea increased by 50% in 2024. Chinese military aircraft incursions into Taiwan's air defense zone jumped from an average of 5 per week to over 20. Satellite imagery shows unprecedented military buildup along the coast facing Taiwan. Internal Chinese Communist Party documents leaked to Australian intelligence in March 2025 revealed contingency plans linking severe economic distress to decisive action on territorial integrity issues, a thinly veiled reference to Taiwan, Hong Kong, and disputed territories. Unlike previous declining powers, China has nuclear weapons, the world's largest army, and a leadership structure that fears losing control above all else. The combination of economic desperation and military capability creates an explosive mix that could lead to catastrophic miscalculation.
Former Premier Li Keqiang admitted as much in a leaked conversation with diplomats, saying China's official statistics were man-made and for reference only. He relied instead on electricity consumption, rail cargo volume, and bank lending as more reliable indicators. By those measures, China's economy is already faltering. Electricity usage has flatlined, rail cargo is declining, banks are forcing loans on reluctant businesses. China's economic miracle ended years ago, says Dr. Michael Beckley of Tufts University. What we're seeing now is the lag between economic reality and global perception. China's innovation economy is equally pathetic. Despite ambitious pronouncements about technological dominance, China remains dependent on foreign technology for its most crucial industries. In 2023, China imported $300 billion worth of semiconductors, more than it spent on crude oil. Its AI sector runs largely on NVIDIA chips designed in America, while its electric vehicles rely on battery technology pioneered in Japan and South Korea. And while its aerospace industry has made progress, China still struggles to produce high-performance jet engines at scale without relying on foreign expertise or components. Even China's surveillance technologies depend on foreign-designed chips and algorithms. China excels at copying and scaling existing technologies, notes Dr. Rebecca Fenin, but true innovation requires intellectual freedom and individual rights, precisely what the Chinese system suppresses. The Chinese Communist Party's answer to these mounting crises? Authoritarian control. As economic prosperity falters, the surveillance state expands. China has installed over 700 million CCTV cameras, nearly one for every 2 citizens. Facial recognition, social credit scoring, and digital currency surveillance have become tools to maintain stability when prosperity fails. It's a new social contract, says political scientist Elizabeth Perry of Harvard. Instead of "we deliver growth, you stay quiet," it's becoming "we ensure security and stability, you follow the rules." China has overbuilt generation but underbuilt transmission, explains Dr. Lin Buquang, Dean of China Institute for Energy Policy Studies. They've prioritized visible power plants over invisible but critical infrastructure. The country's energy dependence extends beyond its borders. Despite massive investments in domestic oil production, China now imports 73% of its oil needs, up from 50% a decade ago. This dependency creates strategic vulnerabilities that military spending cannot resolve. And on the subject of military spending, China faces an impossible balancing act between guns and butter. Military expenditures have increased by 7.2% annually for the past decade, even as economic growth has slowed to 4.5% and lower. The People's Liberation Army now commands enormous financial resources. According to the U.S. Department of Defense, China's true defense spending may have reached as high as $700 billion in 2023, far higher than official figures suggest. This prioritization comes at the direct expense of social services and economic investment at a time when both are desperately needed. Flagship military programs are showing the same pattern of overpromise and underdelivery that plagues civilian initiatives. The much-hyped J-20 stealth fighter can't match American or European counterparts in engine performance. The Type 003 aircraft carrier, meant to demonstrate China's naval prowess, has faced repeated delays and technical problems. China's military budget creates a dangerous illusion of strength, notes Admiral James Stavridis, a former NATO Supreme Allied Commander. They're spending enormous sums on weapons platforms that look impressive but lack the technological sophistication for modern warfare. So, what do you think? Is China's economic decline inevitable, or can Beijing somehow reverse course? How will the unraveling of the world's second-largest economy affect global markets and security in the coming decade? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to Fall of Nations for more videos that expose the shocking realities behind today's biggest global stories. Now go watch 17 facts about China's collapse that seem fake but are 100% real, and tell us what you think.
They said it would connect the world. Instead, it's collapsing, literally. November 2024, a concrete canopy crashes down at a railway station in Serbia, killing 16 people. The renovation was part of China's Belt and Road Initiative, the trillion-dollar project that was supposed to reshape global trade. December 2023, Italy officially withdraws from the BRI, calling it a big mistake. The only G7 nation to join becomes the first to quit. January 2024. Protesters flood the streets of Gwadar, Pakistan, demanding Chinese companies leave their port city. This isn't what Xi Jinping envisioned when he launched the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013. Back then, it was hailed as the project of the century, a new Silk Road that would lift entire continents out of poverty and cement China's role as a global superpower. But today, the BRI is crumbling faster than those Chinese-built projects themselves. In 2024, Chinese BRI engagement reached record highs of over $70 billion. Yet the initiative is facing unprecedented challenges. Countries are defaulting, projects are stalling, and Beijing's grand vision is turning into a geopolitical nightmare. From debt traps in Sri Lanka to corruption scandals in Ecuador, we're about to expose the shocking truth behind China's trillion-dollar gamble and why it's become one of the most humiliating foreign policy disasters in modern history. Because what we're about to discover will change how you see China's global ambitions forever. To understand how spectacularly the BRI has failed, we need to go back to the beginning, to 2013, when Xi Jinping stood before the world and painted a picture of unprecedented global cooperation. The Belt and Road Initiative wasn't just another infrastructure program. It was Xi's signature project, his bid to position China as the benevolent leader of a new world order. The plan was breathtaking in scope. Between 140 and 150 countries would participate, representing almost 75% of the world's population and more than half of global GDP. Beijing promised highways slicing through mountains, railways linking continents, and deep seaports transforming remote coastlines into global trade hubs. Since its establishment in 2013, cumulative BRI engagement reached $1.175 trillion, with about $704 billion in construction contracts and $470 billion in non-financial investments. The timing seemed perfect. Across the developing world, countries desperately needed infrastructure but couldn't secure funding from traditional sources. Western banks saw too much risk. China saw an opportunity. For poor nations, it looked like a miracle. Finally, someone was offering them the roads, ports, and power plants they needed to join the modern economy. No lengthy approval processes, no complex conditions, just Chinese money, Chinese workers, and Chinese promises of prosperity. The early years were intoxicating. High-speed rail lines transformed travel times across Southeast Asia. Modern ports in Africa began handling international shipping. In Pakistan, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor promised to revolutionize the entire region with $60 billion in investment. Xi Jinping basked in the global praise. Here was proof that China's rise could benefit everyone, a stark contrast to America's military interventions and Europe's colonial legacy. But beneath the ribbon-cutting ceremonies and glowing headlines, warning signs were already emerging. Local communities weren't benefiting from these mega projects. Environmental damage was widespread. And most troubling of all, the debt was piling up faster than anyone had anticipated. Still, China pressed ahead. The BRI had become too big to fail, or so Beijing thought. What they didn't realize was that they were building the foundations of their own humiliation. The first cracks in China's grand vision appeared in the most dramatic way possible. Countries started surrendering their sovereignty. Sri Lanka became the poster child for what critics called debt trap diplomacy. Between 2007 and 2012, Sri Lanka secured loans worth over $1 billion from China's Exim Bank to finance the construction of Hambantota Port, despite widespread doubts about the project's profitability. The port was doomed from the start. Sri Lanka initially approached other potential creditors, including India and the Asian Development Bank, but failed to secure financing due to concerns over the port's viability. Ultimately, the Rajapaksa government turned to China, which offered loans at significantly higher interest rates, around 6.3%, compared to the 3% the ADB would have charged. When the port failed to generate revenue and Sri Lanka couldn't service its debts, Beijing made an offer Colombo couldn't refuse: hand over the port for 99 years in exchange for debt relief. China would cancel $1.1 billion off Sri Lanka's debt to China in exchange for the port. But Sri Lanka wasn't alone in this nightmare. Zambia tells an even more devastating story. Once hailed as one of Africa's success stories, Zambia borrowed billions from China for infrastructure projects. In 2020, Zambia became the first African country to default on its BRI loans. Chinese debt had grown to 43% of Zambia's national income, and when the country ran out of money, the fallout was severe. Inflation hit 16.5% in April 2025, and 5.8 million Zambians fell into food insecurity. The human cost was staggering. Families watched their savings evaporate as the currency collapsed. Children dropped out of school because their parents couldn't afford fees. Essential services were cut as the government struggled to pay even basic expenses. Pakistan's experience with the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor reveals another layer of the BRI's failures. By 2022, CPEC had created only a fraction of the jobs promised, and Pakistan's debt repayment obligations to China are mounting. In the port city of Gwadar, there have been large protests against power and water shortages and the presence of Chinese companies, a growing backlash against China's multi-billion-dollar projects. Local fishermen found their livelihoods destroyed by Chinese trawlers, while promised development never materialized. But here's what makes this even more shocking. While these countries were drowning in debt, Chinese officials were getting rich off the chaos. In Montenegro, a tiny Balkan nation of just 620,000 people, China financed what would become one of the BRI's most embarrassing failures. Montenegro borrowed $1 billion, a third of its entire economy, to build a highway. That highway? It literally leads to nowhere. If you want to see the BRI's failures with your own eyes, Montenegro's highway to nowhere is the perfect place to start. China financed the first 41-kilometer segment of a highway through mountainous terrain at a cost of nearly $1 billion. When that initial stretch opened in 2022, it literally petered out in a rural field with no continuation. Montenegro's debt soared to 80% of GDP, and it can't afford to finish the road. Imagine borrowing a third of your country's entire economic output to build a road that goes nowhere. That's not infrastructure development. That's a monument to failed planning. But Montenegro's highway is just one of dozens of white elephant projects littering the BRI landscape. Sri Lanka's Madala Rajapaksa International Airport stands as perhaps the most absurd example. Billed as a second international gateway, it turned into the world's emptiest airport. Few flights land there, and it operates at a tiny fraction of capacity. The White Elephant Airport is so underused that wild elephants wander the empty runways. Think about that image for a moment. Wild elephants roaming freely through an international airport because there are no planes to disturb them. It's almost poetic, nature reclaiming a project that never should have existed. In Kenya, the Chinese-built railway from Nairobi to Mombasa has become a financial black hole. The railway ran into huge operating losses and was criticized for its high cost. Passengers struggled to afford tickets on a line that was supposed to boost economic growth. Environmental destruction has accompanied these infrastructure failures across the globe. In Indonesia, Chinese BRI investment fueled the nickel mining boom. Rainforests were clear-cut and ecosystems devastated to supply nickel for China's electric vehicle battery industry. The human cost has been equally devastating. Construction of railways and mines led to land grabs and displacement in countries like Pakistan and Laos. Promised jobs for locals often failed to materialize, as Chinese companies imported their own workers or the projects were ill-suited to local skills. In parts of Africa, Chinese-built hospitals remained empty because local staff was inadequately trained to run them. Imagine the cruel irony. New hospitals that can't treat patients because no one thought to train local doctors and nurses. But the corruption that enabled these disasters goes even deeper than anyone imagined. In Ecuador, engineers discovered something terrifying about the massive Coca-Cola Sinclair Dam, a $2.6 billion project hailed as a flagship BRI achievement. Engineers discovered 17,000 cracks in its structure. The dam, sitting at the foot of an active volcano, now operates at only partial capacity and is at risk of failure or collapse. How did this happen? because Chinese contractors paid $76 million in bribes to Ecuadorian officials, reaching up to a former vice president, to secure the lucrative dam contract. Corners were cut, quality was ignored, and now an entire region lives under the threat of potential catastrophe. This wasn't development, it was exploitation disguised as partnership. By 2023, the cracks in China's Belt and Road Initiative had become impossible to hide. Countries that once eagerly welcomed Chinese investment were now scrambling to escape their BRI commitments. The most humiliating blow came from an unexpected source: Italy. Italy has withdrawn from China's Belt and Road Initiative more than 4 years after becoming the only group of 7 nations to sign up. For the past year, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni has indicated that joining the BRI was a big mistake that she intended to correct by withdrawing from the initiative. The irony was devastating for Beijing. Italy wasn't some developing nation desperate for infrastructure. It was a founding member of NATO, the world's third-largest economy in Europe and a key Western ally. When Italy joined the BRI in 2019, it was seen as a major diplomatic coup for China. Many Italian officials, including Minister of Foreign Affairs Antonio Tajani, stated that the BRI has not yielded the expected economic benefits for Italy. The 2019 agreement was set to expire in March 2024 with automatic renewal unless Rome provided 3 months written notice of withdrawal. What did Italy get from 4 years in the BRI? Virtually nothing. Italy's exports to China remain a very small share of total exports, while China's influence in Italian ports and infrastructure grew significantly. But Italy's exit was just the beginning of a global backlash. Malaysia launched corruption investigations into BRI projects, ultimately canceling 2 Chinese pipeline projects amid corruption investigations, and renegotiated the cost of a major rail link to nearly half the original price due to overpricing concerns. Myanmar froze the $3.6 billion Milestone Dam project after public protest and is renegotiating a proposed BRI deep sea port to avoid an unsustainable $7 billion debt. Sierra Leone canceled a $300 million Chinese airport deal in 2018, calling it unnecessary. Even Bangladesh and Nepal have withdrawn from certain BRI projects over debt and sovereignty worries. The numbers tell the story of China's retreat. Chinese overseas lending for BRI peaked around 2016 and then plummeted as many loans soured. In 2022, 60% of China's overseas lending went to borrowers in financial distress, compared to just 5% in 2010. The scale of the financial devastation is staggering. By 2023, at least a dozen countries were either in default or renegotiating Chinese debts. And extreme public debt driven by BRI has pushed several poor nations to the brink of bankruptcy. Beijing's loans often come with secret contract terms that prioritize Chinese repayment above other creditors, ensuring Beijing gets paid first even as host nations suffer austerity and instability. The BRI had become a global symbol not of Chinese generosity, but of Chinese exploitation. Behind every failed BRI project lies a web of corruption that makes the mafia look like amateur hour. The Democratic Republic of Congo reveals the true scale of Chinese corruption. Chinese state companies pledged $3 billion of roads and facilities in exchange for mining rights, but built less than $1 billion worth before stalling. Meanwhile, they paid $55 million in bribes to the then President Joseph Kabila's entourage to protect their interests. Malaysia witnessed one of the most brazen abuses. Former Prime Minister Najib Razak allegedly arranged inflated BRI projects to embezzle funds to cover up debts from the 1MDB corruption scandal. Chinese officials helped conceal the theft of as much as $1 billion via those projects. As the former president of China's Export-Import Bank put it, if the water is too clear, you don't catch any fish. Beijing's hands-off approach enabled unscrupulous officials to profit personally, creating high-profile, low-quality projects that left local populations paying the price through debt and poor services. While Beijing marked the BRI as green and sustainable, the environmental reality has been an ecological nightmare. China funded dozens of coal-fired power plants across Asia and Africa, locking countries into high-carbon energy. even after Xi announced in 2021 that China would stop building coal plants abroad. Projects already in the pipeline have continued. In January 2024, a 380 MW coal-fired power plant started operating in Sulawesi, Indonesia. The dam disasters reveal another layer of recklessness. Similar cracks have been reported in Chinese-built dams in Uganda and Pakistan, raising safety fears. In Myanmar, the planned Myitsone Dam would have flooded a huge area and displaced thousands. Often, local people bore the social costs while seeing few benefits. Faced with this mounting disaster, Beijing has been forced into an embarrassing retreat. But rather than admit failure, China has tried to rebrand the BRI as BRI 2.0, a supposedly more sustainable, responsible version of the original. The era of lavish mega projects, huge ports, cross-country railways, and giant highways is waning. Xi Jinping himself has been forced to change his rhetoric. At the 2023 forum, Xi Jinping told the participants that China will pursue high-quality, sustainable cooperation, a tacit admission that the earlier binge led to waste. The new strategy focuses on damage control. From 2020 to 2023, Beijing quietly negotiated dozens of debt rescheduling deals, for example, giving Zambia a grace period and longer maturity and temporarily suspending Sri Lanka's debt payments during its crisis. But even these relief efforts come with strings attached. China often drives a hard bargain, even in relief, insisting its loans be repaid first or in full, and sometimes asking for additional guarantees. Beijing has also tried to shift focus away from massive infrastructure toward digital projects and renewable energy. Rather than focus only on traditional infrastructure, steel and concrete, China is putting more emphasis on digital infrastructure, technology, and energy in BRI. This so-called digital Silk Road means installing fiber optic networks, data centers, telecom equipment, surveillance systems, and other high-tech projects in partner countries. China's energy-related engagement in 2024 was the greenest in absolute and relative terms in any period since the BRI's inception, reaching $11.8 billion, an increase of 60% compared to 2023. The BRI's collapse has triggered a complete realignment of global power dynamics that Beijing never saw coming. Meanwhile, Western powers have finally woken up to challenge China's infrastructure dominance. The United States and Europe have launched alternative initiatives. The G7's Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, PGII, a $600 billion plan, and the EU's Global Gateway Program both aim to offer transparent, high-standard infrastructure financing to developing countries. These programs promise to avoid the mistakes of BRI by providing grants or low-interest loans with safeguards, anti-corruption, environmental standards. But critics note they are late to the game. China spent a decade and over $1 trillion building relationships across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, while Western efforts are just ramping up. China's BRI has also pushed countries into new camps. As Russia became isolated due to its war in Ukraine, Moscow leaned heavily towards Beijing. The two have talked up linking Russia's Eurasian Economic Union infrastructure plans with the new BRI. New rail lines and pipelines are being developed from Russia to China, creating an economic alliance that could challenge American dominance for decades. This strengthening Sino-Russian axis, partially facilitated by BRI connectivity, is one factor fueling talk of a new Cold War dividing the world. But the geopolitical damage to China's reputation may be irreversible. At the 10-year mark of BRI, celebrated in Beijing in October 2023, fewer foreign leaders showed up than China hoped. Many Western-aligned leaders stayed away, especially after China's no-limits friendship with Russia during the Ukraine war made BRI look politically charged. Vladimir Putin was an honored guest at the forum, underlining the emerging BRI alignment with anti-Western partners. But that only deepened skepticism elsewhere. The BRI has become a symbol not of China's rise, but of its overreach. After a decade and over $1 trillion, the Belt and Road Initiative stands as one of the most spectacular foreign policy failures in modern history. The numbers are damning. In 2023, China's policy banks only committed to lending $4.6 billion to African countries versus a commitment of $16.2 billion in 2018. FDI flows to all countries declined from a peak of $196 billion in 2016 to $177 billion in 2023, according to Economics Observatory. But the scale of the crisis goes beyond just declining investment. There has been a rise in emergency rescue lending for those countries whose financial stability was affected by the pandemic. In the last decade, there has been a retrenchment of China's overseas lending, as well as a slowdown of its investment, driven by domestic and external factors. China has had to commit more money to the project, expose itself to further risk, and has had to become entangled in complex local politics. For China itself, a report from Fitch Ratings doubts Chinese banks' ability to control risks, as they do not have a good record of allocating resources efficiently at home. What went wrong? The BRI collapsed because it was never really about development. It was all about control. Beijing designed the BRI to serve China's interest first, exporting excess industrial capacity, securing access to raw materials, and expanding geopolitical influence. The needs of partner countries were secondary considerations at best. The corruption was systematic and widespread. Beijing's policy banks and state firms often negotiated BRI loans in secret with local elites without open bidding or public oversight. This opacity was by design. Chinese lenders rarely disclosed loan terms, and host government officials often found it convenient to bypass accountability. The environmental and social costs were ignored. Projects were rushed through without proper environmental impact assessments or community consultation. Local populations bore the cost, while elites captured the benefits. Most fundamentally, the BRI failed because it was built on an obsolete model of development, one where rich countries impose grand plans on poor countries without genuine partnership or accountability. Behind every failed BRI project are real people whose lives have been shattered by China's broken promises. In Central Asia, collective debt to Beijing reached $15.7 billion by 2023, representing 7.6% of the region's external debt. Kazakhstan alone owes $9.2 billion as of January 1, 2024, primarily to China's Export-Import Bank, Exim Bank. The social consequences have been devastating. In 2018, over 30,000 Chinese migrants arrived in Kyrgyzstan for BRI projects, leading to rising anti-Chinese sentiments. Families have watched traditional livelihoods disappear as Chinese companies move in, while fishing communities have seen their catch diminish as Chinese operations pollute waterways. As one observer wryly noted, the BRI often built highways to nowhere in the developing world, illustrating how poorly conceived projects can fail spectacularly. The broader implications are profound. China's reputation as a responsible global power has been severely damaged. Developing countries have learned hard lessons about the risks of dependence on any single creditor, and the international community has been forced to develop alternatives to Chinese financing. In 2024, China's trade volume with partner countries in the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, grew by 6.4% year-on-year, accounting for over half of China's total trade volume for the first time, according to China Digital Times. But this masks the reality that many of these relationships are now transactional rather than strategic. The BRI was supposed to be Xi Jinping's signature achievement, the project that would define his legacy and cement China's status as a global superpower. Instead, it has become a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the limits of authoritarian development models. The initiative has also revealed the fundamental incompatibility between China's authoritarian governance model and the transparent, accountable development that poor countries actually need. While China can build infrastructure quickly, it struggles with governance reforms and institutional strengthening that make development sustainable. Today, the BRI stands at a crossroads. Chinese Premier Li Qiang recently urged the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank to increase support for the initiative, showing China is doubling down rather than stepping back. We do expect Chinese BRI engagement to reach similar levels in 2025 as in 2024, driven by growing needs of China's domestic players to invest abroad. But the world has learned hard lessons. Countries are more cautious, Western alternatives are emerging, and the age of uncritical acceptance of Chinese infrastructure finance is over. The trillion-dollar question now is whether Beijing can learn from these failures, or whether it'll double down on the very approaches that led to this humiliating collapse. What do you think? Can China salvage the Belt and Road Initiative, or is this the beginning of the end for Beijing's global infrastructure dreams? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you found this deep dive into one of the biggest geopolitical disasters of our time eye-opening, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because we're just getting started on exposing the stories that shape our world. The Belt and Road Initiative promised to connect the world. Instead, it revealed the true cost of China's global ambitions, and that cost $1 trillion and counting.
100 million people didn't just vanish, they were never there. For years, China boasted the numbers: more workers, more babies, more growth, a nation too big to fail. But behind the curtain, the truth was rotting. A fake population, crumbling cities, empty apartments, and an economic model built on ghosts. Now the lie is collapsing in real time, and Beijing is scrambling to control the fallout. Youth joblessness is exploding, ghost cities are multiplying, entire provinces are running out of cash, and the government? Too scared to publish the real numbers. The dragon isn't just wounded, it's hollow. And when it finally breaks, the shockwaves will hit the whole world. Let's expose how China faked its future and why it's now crumbling faster than anyone expected. At exactly 3:25 p.m. on August 27, 2021, the sky over Kunming filled with dust and thunder. 15 skyscrapers, modern towers of glass and steel, collapsed in a single coordinated blast. 4.6 metric tons of explosives turned them to rubble in seconds. But these weren't condemned relics from some forgotten era. They were brand new, built for a population that never showed up. They had stood unfinished and uninhabited for years. Concrete tombstones marking a future that was never coming. That demolition wasn't an anomaly. It was a warning shot. According to Dr. Yi Fujian, a leading demographer at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, China's government has overcounted its population by at least 100 million people. That's more than the entire population of Japan or Egypt or the Philippines, existing only on paper. Phantom citizens, statistical ghosts, fabricated for political theater. Yi's research reveals something chilling. Local officials didn't just estimate wrong, they invented data. Between 1991 and 2000, the government claimed 203 million births across China. But follow-up census found only 164 million people were actually born. Nearly 40 million citizens were conjured from nothing. Ghost entries in government databases, names without faces, lives that never happened. The fraud wasn't random, it was systematic, and it ran deep. Local cadres faced crushing pressure to hit population quotas. Central government funding flowed to provinces based partly on headcounts. More people on paper meant more money from Beijing. So officials fabricated birth records, buried death certificates, and padded numbers year after year. The lies compounded. The databases swelled with phantom citizens. Beijing looked the other way because the illusion served them too. Why? Because population equals power. A larger population made China's aggregate GDP look bigger on the world stage. It made the potential military conscription pool seem more fearsome. It enhanced the economic miracle narrative that attracted trillions in foreign investment. The whole China story, the factories, the skylines, the unstoppable rise, was propped up by citizens who didn't exist. And now, reality is catching up with the brutal, merciless speed. In 2022, China officially admitted its first population decline in 60 years. The first since the catastrophic famine that killed tens of millions in the early 1960s. But Yi Fusion's data suggests the decline actually began around 2018, years before Beijing acknowledged anything. While officials were still claiming marginal growth, the population was already shrinking in the shadows. Think about what this means. Every national plan was built on sand. Factories were expanded for workers who didn't exist. Cities were constructed for families who were never born. Schools were built for children who never arrived. Pension systems and healthcare budgets assumed taxpayers who weren't there to pay. The entire architecture of modern China rests on a foundation of fabricated numbers. The GDP growth targets, which Beijing confidently projected, turning to dust. The World Bank now forecasts China's growth will slow to 4.9% in 2025 and 4.4% by 2026. By decade's end, many economists expect it to crater into the low single digits. The era of double-digit Chinese expansion is dead, and the gap between what Beijing promises and what actually happens is widening into a chasm. But here's where it gets worse. Because this isn't just a numbers game, it's a slow-motion catastrophe already hitting Chinese families where it hurts. If you want to see what an economy built on ghosts actually looks like, take a drive through any of China's ghost cities. Jiapu Financial District in Tianjin was supposed to be China's Manhattan. Gleaming office towers, world-class infrastructure, billions invested. A decade later, it's a mausoleum. Buildings stand empty. Streets stretch for miles without a pedestrian. Streetlights illuminate nothing but concrete and absence. This isn't an isolated failure. By some estimates, China now has between 65 and 80 million empty apartments. Enough housing to shelter the populations of the United Kingdom and Sweden combined. Entire districts of unsold units gathering dust. Entire skylines where only a handful of windows glow at night. Cities built for millions, inhabited by hundreds. Here's where the terror really sets in. About 70% of Chinese household wealth is locked up in real estate. 70%. In the United States, that figure is closer to 35%. Chinese families bet everything, their savings, their futures, their children's futures on property. And those property values have been falling for 36 consecutive months. 3 straight years of bleeding with no floor in sight. Imagine waking up tomorrow to discover your home is worth half of what you paid. Now multiply that nightmare by hundreds of millions of families. That's not a hypothetical, that's China right now. The carnage among developers defies belief. Evergrande, once China's second largest developer, collapsed under more than $300 billion in liabilities. One of the largest debt failures in history. Country Garden, the nation's top developer by sales, defaulted on $11 billion in offshore bonds. Shimeo, Sunac, Fantasia, Kaisa. At least 50 major developers have defaulted since 2021. It's not a correction, it's an extinction event. Each default isn't just a line item on a balance sheet. It's millions of families watching their life savings evaporate before their eyes. Evergrande alone pre-sold apartments to more than 1.5 million customers, families who handed over their savings for homes that may never be completed. Across China, middle-class couples paid everything they had for units and projects now frozen as half-built skeletons of rebar and concrete. In 2022, desperate homebuyers in more than 100 cities staged an unprecedented mortgage boycott, refusing to keep paying for apartments that didn't exist. Footage leaked of crowds massing outside banks, faces twisted with rage and despair, chanting, "Give us our homes!" The video spread for hours before censors scrubbed them from the internet. The human wreckage is staggering. People who did everything right, worked brutal hours for decades, saved every yuan, invested exactly as they were told, have watched their wealth vanish overnight. Young couples who scraped together down payments by borrowing from parents, aunts, uncles, and grandparents now owe money on apartments that may never be built. Elderly retirees who sank their life savings into investment properties for income now clutch worthless deeds to empty shells. The social contract that held China together for decades, rising prosperity in exchange for political obedience, is fracturing. That bargain depended on one unspoken promise: tomorrow will always be better than today. But when homes lose value year after year, when jobs evaporate, when the future looks bleaker than the past, that promise shatters, and with it, something fundamental breaks in the relationship between the people and the party. The property collapse sends shockwaves through every layer of the economy. Local governments, which depend heavily on selling land to developers for revenue, are drowning in debt. Land sales have dried up. Tax income has cratered. Some cities have resorted to auctioning off officials' luxury vehicles and furniture just to keep the lights on. In several provinces, civil servants have watched their salaries slashed by 30 to 50%. Reports emerged of government workers being paid in bags of rice and cooking oil because local treasuries were empty. Hospitals in poorer regions couldn't afford basic medical supplies, and health budgets went bankrupt. And it's still accelerating. Home prices keep falling. Consumer confidence is collapsing. Families watching their biggest asset bleed value have slammed their wallets shut. They're not spending on cars or vacations or appliances anymore. They're hoarding cash and bracing for worse. It's a vicious cycle feeding on itself, spiraling towards something far darker. But the economic wreckage is only part of their story. Because behind the collapsing numbers, an entire generation is being erased from the future. In mid-2023, China's official youth unemployment rate hit 21.3%, the highest ever recorded. That's double the rate in the United States. Young people lining up outside job fairs that have nothing to offer. College graduates clutching diplomas that mean nothing in a market with no openings. And then, without warning, the government stopped publishing the data. The National Bureau of Statistics announced it would suspend youth unemployment figures to refine the methodology. Translation: the numbers had become too humiliating to show the world. A spokesman later hinted they might exclude college students entirely from future counts. Anything to make the statistics less catastrophic. Of course, hiding data doesn't make the crisis disappear. Independent economists estimate the real unemployment or underemployment rate for young Chinese is closer to 46.5%, nearly half the generation, when you count those who've given up looking or are trapped in dead-end gig work. A Peking University professor named Zhang Dadan published that estimate. Her report was censored and scrubbed from the internet within days, which tells you everything about how close to the truth it was. China now churns out roughly 11 million new college graduates every year. The economy can't absorb them. Many end up delivering food on scooters or driving ride-hailing apps, positions miles below their qualifications. A bitter term has gone viral: full-time children, educated adults forced to move back in with their parents because they cannot find work. They're not launching careers, they're not starting families. They're waiting for a future that keeps receding. The despair runs deeper. Jinping, lying flat, has swept through Chinese youth culture. It means opting out entirely, rejecting the 996 grind for minimal effort, minimal consumption, minimal ambition. Another phrase, Beilan, let it rot. Stop trying. The system is rigged, so why play? These aren't internet jokes, they're acts of quiet rebellion from a generation that sees no path forward. This year, a record 2.8 million people sat for China's National Civil Service exam, competing for just 37,000 government positions. That's roughly 76 applicants per seat. Some postings saw odds worse than 1,000 to 1. Why the frenzy? Because in an economy hemorrhaging private sector jobs, a government position is one of the last stable options remaining. The Iron Rice Bowl is back, not as a symbol of prosperity, but as a life raft in a sinking economy. Meanwhile, China's working-age population has been shrinking since 2015. For nearly a decade, more people have been leaving the workforce than entering it. By 2050, projections show more than 200 million fewer workers than 2020, a decline of nearly a quarter. That's like losing the entire American labor force, plus tens of millions more. Factories in the export powerhouses of Guangdong and Beijing have already reported severe labor shortages. Some have raised wages 30 to 40% just to attract entry-level workers, destroying the cheap labor advantage that made China the world's factory floor. Companies that can't find or afford workers are packing up and leaving for Vietnam, India, Mexico. The exodus is accelerating. And as the workforce vanishes, so does the engine that powered China's rise. But what if that rise was never what it appeared to be? What if the miracle was always a mirage? Yi Fujian's research shows that China's censuses have been systematically inflated since the 1990s. Local officials fabricated birth records to extract more funding from Beijing. The central government weaponized those inflated figures to project power on the global stage. The motive was coldly simple: bigger population equals a bigger GDP. Larger military potential, more international clout. It didn't matter if it was real. It only mattered that the world believed it. Now look at the birth rate collapse tearing through the country. In 2024, China recorded just 6.77 births per 1,000 people, even lower than aging Japan, and roughly half the rate needed to maintain a stable population. The nation that once feared overpopulation now can't pay, persuade, or propagandize its citizens into having children. The one-child policy, enforced with brutal efficiency from 1980 to 2015, permanently rewired Chinese society. Even after Beijing lifted restrictions to allow 2 children, then 3, births kept plummeting. There was no rebound. None. Young couples looked at skyrocketing housing costs, crushing work hours, and the astronomical expense of raising a child through China's hyper-competitive education system, and chose to have fewer children or none at all. A survey by China's Communist Youth League found 44% of urban young women don't plan to marry. No marriage often means no children. The demographic pipeline has run dry. The government has thrown everything at the problem. Cash bonuses equivalent to $1,400 for newborns in some cities. Tax breaks, propaganda campaigns urging that having children is a family responsibility. Nothing works. Births hit record lows even as restrictions loosened. The projections are apocalyptic. Some forecasts suggest China's population could shrink by half before the century ends, from 1.4 billion to somewhere between 600 and 700 million. This isn't a distant threat on some far horizon. It's happening now, accelerating with each passing year. By 2035, China will have over 400 million senior citizens, more elderly than the entire population of the United States. The Chinese Academy of Sciences warns the national pension system could run completely dry by then. Healthcare infrastructure is unprepared. Social safety nets are threadbare. China is growing old before it ever got rich, and it's wrestling with another crisis: resources. China holds 20% of the world's population, but only 7% of its fresh water. Up to 90% of groundwater in major cities is polluted. The water table beneath Beijing has dropped nearly 1,000 feet. Vast regions face shortages that could make them barely habitable within decades. A shrinking population might ease some of that pressure. Fewer mouths to feed, less demand on aquifers. But economic contraction makes everything harder. Less tax revenue for environmental cleanup, less investment in infrastructure, less capacity to adapt. The problems don't disappear, they compound. The whole system was built assuming a workforce and consumer base that was never as large as Beijing claimed. This wasn't incompetence, it was just theater. Carefully staged, meticulously maintained, ruthlessly protected. But the curtain is finally falling, and now Beijing's greatest fear isn't foreign enemies, it's the truth. Here's what the party doesn't want you to see: it's not just hiding economic data, they're erasing reality itself. When youth unemployment became too embarrassing to publish, the authorities stopped reporting it. When mortgage protests erupted across 100 cities, censors scrubbed the footage within hours. When economists published inconvenient findings, their research vanished. The pattern is consistent. Any data contradicting the official narrative gets buried. In 2022, a hacker calling himself China Dan breached the Shanghai Public Security Bureau's database and extracted records on approximately 970 million people. He posted samples and offered the full data set on the dark web. Security researchers verified the phone numbers and ID information were real, actual Chinese citizens in an actual government database. The implication is explosive. If that database represents China's national registry, and analysts believe it does, since police networks are interconnected across the country, then the official population of 1.4 billion is a fantasy. The leaked data suggests a number closer to 1 billion. Even mundane statistics tell a damning story. Between 2015 and 2019, China produced roughly 66 million tons of raw salt annually. By 2022, that figure dropped below 50 million tons, a decline of roughly 25%. Salt consumption is nearly impossible to fake. Everyone needs it, rich and poor alike. You can't stockpile it like gold. If production collapsed because fewer people were consuming it, the population implications are staggering. The government's response to mounting evidence? Not transparency, not reform. More control, more silence. China now spends more on internal security, including police, surveillance cameras, facial recognition, riot control, than on its military. The party fears its own people more than any foreign enemy. Whistleblowers face prison. Journalists face harassment. The silence isn't natural, it's manufactured. But data doesn't vanish just because it's hidden, and neither does reality. Eventually, the weight of truth becomes too heavy to suppress. And when China's collapse accelerates, don't think you'll be watching from a safe distance. The fallout won't stay within China's borders. China is the largest trading partner for over 120 countries. It dominates global exports of electronics, machinery, textiles, pharmaceuticals, and countless other products that fill your home, your office, your hospital. If Chinese factories falter or exports nosedive, supply chains worldwide seize up overnight. We got a preview during COVID lockdowns, shortages of auto parts, iPhone components, medical supplies, production lines halted, shelves emptied. Now imagine that disruption sustained indefinitely, not from a virus, but from economic implosion. The financial exposure cuts deep. Chinese investors have poured capital into assets worldwide: Vancouver condos, London towers, Wall Street equities. If a domestic crisis forces them to repatriate, asset prices globally could crater. China holds around $800 billion in U.S. Treasury bonds. If Beijing started dumping them out of desperation or as a weapon, it could spike American interest rates and send shockwaves through every market on the planet. Then there's the stranglehold on critical supplies. China processes about 85% of the world's rare earth elements. The metals inside your smartphone, your electric car, your guided missiles. It produces over 80% of global solar panels and roughly 75% of lithium-ion batteries. It manufactures the ingredients for antibiotics and countless other pharmaceuticals. A disorderly Chinese contraction wouldn't just raise prices, it could cause critical shortages. Hospitals rationing antibiotics, factories unable to source components, green energy transitions grinding to a halt. The modern economy is wired through China in ways most people never see until something breaks. Australia rode a China-fueled commodities boom for 2 decades. If Chinese construction collapses, Australian mines face ruin. Brazil exports mountains of iron ore and soybeans to Chinese buyers. A downturn devastates Brazilian farmers and miners. Germany sells millions of luxury cars to Chinese consumers. Evaporating demand hammers German automakers. Every continent has deep economic arteries running to China's appetite. A Chinese collapse isn't like North Korea crumbling, isolated, contained, a regional problem. It's more like the entire European Union melting down at once. The shock would ripple everywhere. The recovery would take a decade or more. And there's a darker possibility. Declining powers can be more dangerous than rising ones. When domestic legitimacy crumbles, authoritarian regimes manufacture foreign crises to redirect public rage. Rally around the flag, blame the enemy abroad. Chinese fighter jets are already harassing U.S. aircraft over the South China Sea. Warplanes buzz Taiwan's air defense zone in record numbers. Xi Jinping's rhetoric on reunification grows more urgent by the month. Nationalism is the party's emergency pressure valve. If Beijing feels cornered, the temptation to manufacture a confrontation could prove overwhelming. And unlike the Soviet Union, which collapsed peacefully, China possesses a vast modern military and a growing nuclear arsenal. When China sneezes, the world catches a cold. Right now, China isn't sneezing, it's hemorrhaging, and the blood is starting to spread. Here's the truth no one in power wants to admit. The unstoppable dragon was always a mirage. A population inflated by 100 million ghosts. An economy propped up by a property bubble now collapsing in real time. A generation with no jobs, no prospects, no faith in the future. Hundreds of millions of elderly facing pensions that may not exist. Local governments so broke they're paying workers in rice. And a regime so terrified of the truth that it has chosen to censor reality itself rather than confront it. For decades, China projected invincibility through spectacle, glittering skylines, high-speed rail networks, military parades, economic growth rates that defied gravity. They weren't defying gravity. They were fabrications dressed up as miracles. The bill is coming due. The demographic collapse is irreversible. You cannot will babies into existence. The debt is unsustainable, estimated at roughly 300% of GDP when you count government, corporate, and household obligations combined. The deception is unraveling faster than any propaganda machine can patch it. And when the system finally cracks, when the hollow dragon finally breaks apart, the shockwaves won't stay contained within China's borders. They'll ripple through global supply chains, crash through financial markets, and destabilize geopolitics for decades to come. This is what happens when data becomes propaganda, when governments manufacture reality instead of confronting it, when entire nations are built on foundations of sand, wishful thinking, and statistical fraud. 100 million didn't just vanish, they never existed. And now, the lie that hid them is crumbling before the world's eyes. The ghost cities stand empty. The pension funds are draining. The young have no jobs. The old have no one. And the government that promised endless prosperity can't even publish the truth about unemployment. Is China's decline inevitable? Can Beijing defuse this time bomb? Or has the damage already been done, baked into decades of fraud and debt? Let us know what you think in the comments. If this video opened your eyes, hit that like button and subscribe to Fall of Nations for more deep dives into the forces reshaping our world. Because the dragon's rise was the defining story of the early 21st century. Its fall may define what comes next. Stay informed, stay watching.
Xi Jinping didn't just rise to power, he clawed his way to the top through exile, humiliation, and the ruins of Mao's mistakes. And once he got there, he made a vow. Never again would China's rulers be weak. Never again would the party lose control. So he destroyed rivals, silenced billionaires, rewrote history. He made himself untouchable, chairman of everything. And for a while, it worked. The West watched in awe as Xi's China soared, factories booming, cities exploding upward, and a military rising fast. But now, the cracks are too big to hide. The miracle is breaking, because in trying to make China stronger than ever, Xi Jinping may have just set it on a path to collapse. What comes next isn't war, it isn't a revolution, it's something quieter but far more dangerous. The fall of China won't explode, it'll erode, and it's already begun. To understand how we got here, we need to go back to where Xi Jinping's obsession with power was born. Not in the halls of Beijing, not in the boardrooms of the party elite, but in a cave. In the 1960s, Mao Zedong, the man who founded the People's Republic, launched one of the most violent political purges in human history, the Cultural Revolution. It was meant to enforce ideological purity and cement Mao's grip on power. In reality, it unleashed chaos on a scale the world had rarely seen. Red Guard mobs roamed the streets, dragging officials from their homes, beating them in public, destroying anyone deemed disloyal to Mao's vision. No one was safe. Not intellectuals, not artists, not even the highest-ranking officials in the party. Between 40 and 80 million people died during Mao's reign, from famine, persecution, and violence. Top officials weren't safe. Old revolutionaries weren't safe. Even Mao's chosen successor died in a mysterious plane crash fleeing Mao's wrath. And among those targeted was a man named Xi Zhongxun, a revolutionary hero who had once helped save Mao's army from destruction during the legendary Long March. Xi Zhongxun was Xi Jinping's father. None of that mattered during the Cultural Revolution. He was paraded through the streets with a dunce cap on his head, denounced as a traitor, beaten by jeering crowds, thrown into prison for 8 years, and his family torn apart. In 1969, 15-year-old Xi Jinping was ripped from his elite Beijing school and sent to the countryside to perform hard labor. He lived in a cave dwelling in a remote village, dug ditches, shoveled grain. He was always hungry, doing backbreaking work with barely enough food for a growing teenager. The most powerful man in China, Chairman Mao, had ruined Xi Jinping's life. His childhood was stolen, his family was shattered, everything he knew was destroyed. But here's the twist that would shape the future of a billion people. Despite everything the party had done to his family, Xi didn't turn against it. He studied it. He watched, he learned, and he understood something fundamental. In China, power is everything. Those without it are at the mercy of events. Those who have it can destroy anyone, even revolutionary heroes with decades of service, and Xi Jinping decided he would never be powerless again. If he wanted to restore his family's honor and secure his future, he had to rise within the very system that had tried to crush him. When Mao finally died in 1976, the nightmare ended. A new leader, Deng Xiaoping, took over and asked a crucial question that would define China's next 4 decades. How do we prevent another Mao? The answer was collective leadership. Power shared among top officials, so no single person could become a dictator. Deng himself had been purged twice during Mao's campaigns. He knew firsthand the danger of one-man rule, so he built in guardrails, term limits, rotation of power, multiple voices at the top, internal checks and balances. And then Deng did something even more revolutionary. He opened China's economy to the world. Foreign investment flooded in. Entrepreneurs built empires, special economic zones transformed fishing villages into megacities, and China's GDP exploded from a backwater economy into a global powerhouse. Over the next 30 years, hundreds of millions climbed out of poverty. By the 2000s, China had become the world's second largest economy. It was the greatest economic transformation in human history, built on a simple formula: collective leadership plus economic openness equals stability and prosperity. But Xi Jinping wasn't celebrating. He was climbing, and he was taking notes. While other ambitious princelings, children of revolutionary elites, jockeyed for the attention in Beijing during the 1980s and 90s, Xi did something unexpected. He disappeared into the provinces. He left the capital and went far from the spotlight. He took modest local party jobs in backwater areas no one else wanted. First Hebei, a rural province near Beijing, then Fujian, a coastal region across from Taiwan with a heavy military presence. For 17 years in Fujian alone, he quietly built relationships with military commanders stationed there. He learned to speak that language, earned their trust, cultivated connections that would prove invaluable later. Building good relations with the PLA would serve him well when he needed their support, and nobody in Beijing noticed what he was doing. They were too busy watching his rivals. After Fujian, Xi moved to Zhejiang, a booming entrepreneurial province where he burnished his credentials as a pro-business reformer and competent administrator overseeing rapid economic growth. Then came Shanghai. In 2007, the city's party chief was disgraced in a corruption scandal. Beijing needed a steady hand to restore order, someone clean, reliable, uncontroversial. Xi got the job. He spent only 7 months there, but it was enough. He kept the city stable, he impressed the right people, and suddenly the man who had spent decades building his base far from Beijing was catapulted into the Politburo Standing Committee, the innermost circle of power. Why Xi? The kingmakers wanted someone safe. a princeling with revolutionary heritage, but not too ambitious, not too threatening. Someone who would maintain the status quo. Xi, with his long patience-tested career in the hinterlands, seemed like the perfect compromise. He appeared reliably orthodox, cautious, controllable. They were wrong. Very wrong. In 2012, Xi Jinping took the throne as General Secretary of the Communist Party, and almost immediately he began dismantling the system that had brought him there. His weapon was an anti-corruption campaign. On paper, it was about cleaning up a party riddled with graft. Corruption had indeed become endemic. Officials at every level were skimming money, accepting bribes, living lavishly while ordinary Chinese struggled. The public hated it, and Xi promised to change it by going after both low-level flies and high-level tigers. In reality, it was a purge. Over 6 million officials have been punished or disciplined since Xi took power. Hundreds of generals, provincial bosses, and party elites were arrested or removed. Zhou Yongkang, the former secretary-chief and one of the most powerful men in China, imprisoned. Top military commanders, gone. Powerful provincial leaders, swept away. And here's what really matters. Most of them were linked to rival power networks or harbored loyalty to former leaders. Xi wasn't just fighting corruption, he was systemically eliminating anyone who might challenge him. And he was filling the vacancies with his own loyalists. Fear swept through the bureaucracy, and this was exactly what Xi wanted. Local officials stopped making decisions on their own. They waited for instructions from the top, rather than risk doing something that might later be called disloyal or corrupt. The flexibility that had powered China's economic miracle, the local experimentation, the entrepreneurial risk-taking, the willingness to try new approaches, began to freeze. Innovation was replaced by compliance. Initiative was replaced by fear. But Xi was just getting started. At the 2017 Party Congress, Xi unveiled his new leadership lineup, and something was conspicuously missing. There was no obvious successor. No younger rising star being groomed to take over in 2022. For every leader since Deng, naming a successor was standard practice. It guaranteed peaceful transitions of power and gave the party stability. Xi broke the pattern deliberately. Within months, China's rubber-stamped legislature formally abolished presidential term limits. The guardrails Deng had built after Mao, gone. Xi could now rule indefinitely, and in 2021, he pushed through a third historical resolution, only the third such document in party history, placing Xi alongside Mao and Deng as a transformational figure. The resolution enshrined Xi Jinping's thought at the core of the party's ideology. His ideas became gospel, questioning them became heresy. By 2022, any remaining senior figures who might have checked Xi's power were gone. Xi secured an unprecedented third term and stacked the 7-member standing committee entirely with his loyalists. Not a single independent voice remained. In a moment that sent chills through China watchers worldwide, his predecessor Hu Jintao was physically escorted out of the closing ceremony. Cameras rolling, the world watching. The old collective leadership was literally shown the door. Xi Jinping had made himself the most powerful Chinese leader since Mao. As one expert noted, no one is left whose ideology differs from Xi. He had achieved what he had set out to do: total, unchallenged control. But power that absolute doesn't just dominate, it distorts. And that's where China's fall begins. Because Xi didn't just seize political control, he went to war with the very forces that made China rich. In November 2020, Jack Ma, China's most famous billionaire, the founder of Alibaba and a global symbol of Chinese entrepreneurial success, gave a speech criticizing financial regulators. He called them outdated, overly cautious, standing in the way of innovation. Days later, his company's $37 billion IPO, what would have been the largest in history, was killed overnight. Ma himself vanished from public view for months. No explanation, no trial, just silence. The message was clear: no one is above the party, not even China's richest man. What followed was a regulatory blitzkrieg that stunned the business world. Alibaba was fined $2.75 billion for antitrust violations. Didi, China's ride-hailing giant, was delisted from the New York Stock Exchange and punished for data security violations. Tencent, Meituan, and other tech giants faced investigations and restrictions. Companies that had created millions of high-paying jobs saw their stock prices collapse. Over $1 trillion in market value, more than the entire GDP of France, was wiped out in the crackdown. Then came education. In 2021, Beijing banned for-profit tutoring in core school subjects overnight. No warning, no transition period, $100 billion industry gone. Companies that had employed tens of thousands of young professionals simply ceased to exist. New Oriental Education, one of the largest tutoring firms, saw over $7 billion in value evaporate. Hundreds of thousands of jobs vanished. And here's where it gets darker. By mid-2023, youth employment hit 21.3%, the highest on record. 1 in 5 young Chinese couldn't find work. Some analysts believe the real number was even higher in major cities, possibly 1 in 3. But instead of addressing the crisis, the government did something remarkable. They stopped publishing the data. In August 2023, officials announced they were suspending the youth unemployment statistic, claiming they needed to revise the methodology. They just erased the number from the official record. The public reaction on Chinese social media was scathing. Users accused the government of burying its head in the sand, but the posts were quickly censored as if hiding the problem would make them disappear. Foreign investors noticed and they started leaving. In 2023, foreign direct investment into China plunged by 90% compared to 2 years earlier, hitting a 30-year low of just $33 billion. Businesses that once saw China as the land of opportunity now saw it as a risk not worth taking. Xi's anti-espionage law made normal business activities potentially criminal. Market research could be espionage. Due diligence, suspicious. The atmosphere for foreign companies turned hostile and opaque. But the billionaires and tech giants were just the opening act. What came next hit ordinary families far harder, and it's tearing at the foundation of Chinese society. For decades, real estate was China's golden ticket, the safest investment, the path to middle-class security. Property values only went up, everyone believed that, so families poured their life savings into apartments. Banks lent freely to developers, local governments sold land at premium prices to fund their budgets. At its peak, housing and property-related industries made up nearly 30% of China's GDP. Roughly 70% of household wealth was tied up in real estate, twice the rate in America. Then the bubble burst. In 2020, Xi's government introduced the Free Red Lines policy to restrict developer borrowing. It was meant to reduce risk. Instead, it triggered a cascade of defaults. In 2021, Evergrande, once China's second largest developer, defaulted on over $300 billion in debt. By 2023, Country Garden followed with $200 billion more. Developers representing roughly 40% of Chinese home sales have now defaulted. The fallout has been brutal. Property prices have collapsed 20 to 30% in many cities. There are enough empty apartments in China to house 3 billion people. Yes, billion. Entire new districts built during the boom years sit eerily vacant. Ghost cities. In Dongguan, once nicknamed the world's workshop, whole neighborhoods of high-rises are dark at night, unsold, unoccupied. Local real estate agents reports going months without a single sale. And then there are the families caught in the middle. Consider Chang Wei and his wife in Shenzhen. In 2020, they spent their life savings, around $400,000, on a pre-sale for a new apartment. They believed it was a safe investment. Everyone did. Today, that apartment is worth maybe half what they paid, if they're lucky. Developers had sold homes before they were built, using new buyers' money to finish earlier projects. It was a Ponzi scheme that worked until it didn't. Across China, over 20 million pre-sold apartments have never been completed. Millions of middle-class families are trapped. They've paid for homes that might never be built, and their deposits are gone. This has sparked widespread anger and mortgage boycotts, with families refusing to pay loans on stalled projects. This isn't just a financial crisis, it's a crisis of trust. Trust in the housing market and ultimately trust in the government's promise of prosperity. And it gets worse. local governments financed themselves primarily by selling land to developers. In some cities, 40% of revenue came from land sales during the boom years. Now, with developers broke and land sales dried up, local government coffers are empty. Many cities are deeply in debt after years of infrastructure spending, often encouraged by Beijing to hit growth targets. The result? Local governments across China are slashing expenses in ways that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. In Henan province, some civil servants had their salaries cut by 50%. Even in wealthy Guangdong, officials saw pay cuts up to 30%. Some cities have turned off streetlights to save electricity. Tianjin, a major metropolis, started auctioning off government buildings. Basic services are being strained: schools, hospitals, road maintenance. But the real estate collapse is just one domino, because the factories that made China the world's workshop, they're leaving too. Apple, the crown jewel of electronics manufacturing in China, is rapidly shifting production. By 2025, India overtook China as the top smartphone exporter to the United States. 44% of US iPhone imports now come from India, up from just 13% a year earlier. China's share collapsed from 61% to 25%. Apple now aims to produce a majority of iPhones for the American market in India by 2026, a massive pivot away from the country that built its supply chain. Samsung closed its last smartphone factory in China in 2019 and moved production to Vietnam and India. Nike manufactures more footwear in Vietnam and Indonesia than in China now. Even Chinese companies are fleeing. BYD, China's largest electric car maker, is building plants in Thailand and Mexico to serve overseas markets. In 2023 alone, over 300 major factory projects left China. Vietnam's exports to the US have tripled since 2018. For the first time in 40 years, China's share of global manufacturing is shrinking. And none of this can be fixed quickly, because China is facing a crisis even Xi cannot command away: demographics. China's population is now shrinking. For the first time since the Great Famine of 1961, deaths are outpacing births. In 2023, China lost over 2 million people. For every 17 people who died, only 10 babies were born. The fertility rate has collapsed to just 1.18 children per woman, far below the 2.1 needed to simply maintain the population. New births hit a record low. By 2035, 1 in 3 Chinese will be over 60. 400 million senior citizens, more than the entire US population. Meanwhile, the working age population peaked around 2014. China's workforce has shrunk by at least 40 million since Xi took office. Every year, 3 to 4 million fewer workers are available. Fewer people to run factories, fewer people to innovate, fewer taxpayers to fund pensions, and critically, fewer people to support the elderly. This is the legacy of the one-child policy. Combined with the rising costs that make young couples unwilling to have children, Xi's government has tried incentives. Couples can now have 3 children, but you can't create 20-year-old workers overnight. And many young Chinese have lost hope that raising children is even viable. A viral trend called lying flat captures the mood. Young people opting out of the rat race entirely. No career, no home, no marriage, no children. Just the bare minimum. Another slogan, "Let it rot," reflects defeated resignation. These represent millions who have lost faith in the promise of a better tomorrow. Consider Liu Ming, a 24-year-old engineering graduate in Shanghai. His parents sacrificed everything to put him through university. They expected he'd support them as they age. But Liu hasn't found an engineering job in 8 months. He now works as a food delivery rider for meager pay. He can barely support himself. Multiply his story by millions. A generation whose faith is shattered. And when people lose faith, sometimes they do something no one expects. In November 2022, after nearly 3 years of brutal COVID lockdowns, protests erupted across China, the largest since Tiananmen Square. In Shanghai, Beijing, Wuhan, and cities across the country, thousands demanded an end to Xi's zero-COVID policy. They held up blank sheets of white paper, symbolizing censored speech, and in Shanghai, crowds chanted words that hadn't been heard in decades. Down with the CCP, down with Xi Jinping. The boldest public challenge to Xi's rule ever. Within days, the government abandoned its COVID restrictions, proving even Xi could be moved when pushed to the brink. But the protest revealed something deeper. The social contract, tolerate authoritarian rule in exchange for rising prosperity, is fraying. For 40 years, the deal held. Life kept getting better, your children's lives would be better than yours. Under Xi, that contract is breaking. And even inside the party, cracks are showing. Qin Gang, China's foreign minister, a Xi loyalist, vanished mid-2023 with no explanation. Defense Minister Li Shangfu followed shortly after. Military purges have demoralized the PLA. The message leaking to foreign journalists, Xi doesn't listen anymore. He's surrounded by yes men. He rose by eliminating opposition, but in doing so, he left no one to tell him when he's wrong. So what does China's fall actually look like? It won't look like revolution, no dramatic collapse, no tanks in the streets. It will look like rot. Quiet, gradual, irreversible. Factories closing one after another, graduates giving up, small businesses folding, parents deciding to have no children, scientists emigrating, local governments selling assets, and the average person's life stopping its upward climb, maybe even sliding backwards. Xi often speaks of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. Nationalism is rising. The propaganda machine blames foreign forces. Trust the party, trust Xi. But as one Chinese citizen quipped before censors deleted it, you can't eat patriotism. Pride won't pay the bills, pride won't build the apartments that were never finished. This is how nations decline, not in fire, but in slow erosion of optimism. The pillars that sustain China's rise, openness, flexibility, economic freedom, demographic movement, are crumbling. And many of these problems were accelerated by Xi's own choices. The man who swore to restore China's greatness may be the reason it never rises again. The fall of China won't explode, it'll erode. And we're watching it happen right now. So, what do you think? Is this a temporary setback or the beginning of something much bigger? Will Xi course correct before it's too late, or has he already passed the point of no return? Let us know in the comments, and if you want to understand where this is all heading, subscribe to Fall of Nations, because this story is far from over.
They drilled 3,280 feet into Chinese soil and exposed a collapse Xi Jinping can't cover up. It wasn't oil, it wasn't gold, it was proof that China is dying of thirst. Beneath the factories, the farms, the megacities lies devastation. Aquifers emptied, groundwater poisoned, land sinking, cities cracking. This isn't speculation, it's science. Xi's own hydrologists now admit Beijing's water table has fallen by hundreds of feet. Entire regions are collapsing into hollow ground, and no amount of propaganda can refill what's been drained. For decades, the Chinese Communist Party built an empire on borrowed water. Now, the debt is coming due. This drill didn't just expose the earth, it pierced the illusion and hit the truth. And that truth? China's greatest threat isn't foreign invasion, it's what's missing under its own feet. Let's dig into what Beijing doesn't want you to see and what's already too late to stop. Picture this: 28,000 rivers, gone, vanished in just 25 years, erased from the map. Rivers that sustained Chinese civilization for millennia simply ceased to exist. In some villages, elderly residents tell stories of rivers where they swam as children, where they caught fish, where communities gathered. Their grandchildren have never seen water flow there, not once. The riverbed is just cracked dirt now, a gray scar cutting through the landscape.
The Yellow River, the mother river of Chinese civilization, where the first dynasties emerged 5,000 years ago, now flows at barely 10% of what it carried in the 1940s. Entire stretches run completely dry for months at a time. Where fishing boats once crowded the waters, where trade barges carried goods between cities, there's nothing but cracked earth stretching into the horizon. Riverbeds that carried the lifeblood of dynasties now look like lunar landscapes, gray, lifeless, dead. And here's what's happening right now in cities across northern China. Hotels ration water to 1 hour per day. 1 hour to shower, wash your hands, brush your teeth, live. Not in some remote rural village, in major cities across a nation that calls itself a superpower. Business travelers check into hotels and find notices posted, water available 7 to 8 a.m. only. After that, taps run dry until the next morning. This is the reality in a country that built entire megacities from nothing in under a decade. Beijing, the gleaming capital, seat of communist power, has water availability of just 250 cubic meters per person annually. That's half the threshold the UN defines as extreme scarcity. The kind of number you'd expect from desert nations in the Middle East, not from the capital of the world's second largest economy. It's less water per person than many residents of Saudi Arabia have access to. Let that sink in. Let that sink in for a moment. But it's not just Beijing. 12 provinces covering 41% of China's population now face severe water shortages. These aren't empty wastelands on the edges of the empire. These regions produce 38% of China's agricultural output, 46% of industrial production, half the nation's electricity generation. The engine of Chinese power, the factories, the farms, the infrastructure that built China's rise is running on vapors. So here's the question everyone should be asking. How are millions of faucets still running? How do factories operate? How does life continue? The answer lies underground, and it's terrifying. When the rivers began dying, China turned desperate. They drilled, and when shallow wells ran dry, they drilled deeper still. Wells that once tapped water at 30 meters, about the height of a 10-story building, now plunge hundreds of meters down. Some go over a kilometer deep, drilling through solid bedrock to reach ancient aquifers formed during the Ice Age. Fossil water that accumulated drop by drop over tens of thousands of years while mammoths still walked the earth and humans lived in caves. Water that was never supposed to be touched. Emergency reserves that should have been saved for the direst scenarios imaginable. China has been draining it for decades, treating ancient geological wealth like an infinite resource. Beijing's own government admits 2/3 of its provinces are over-extracting groundwater. When you hear that phrase, over-extracting, what it really means is this: pumping water out faster than rainfall and rivers can possibly refill it. Mining water like it's coal, treating a renewable resource as if it's disposable. And when a regime that habitually covers up disasters and censors bad news publicly confesses to a crisis of this magnitude, you know the situation has already spiraled far beyond control. Some regions are tapping what officials call deep groundwater, reserves so far down that accessing them was never part of any sane water management plan. These are supposed to be emergency supplies, last resort reserves for civilization-ending scenarios. China touched them in the 1980s and never stopped. Now those reserves are running dry too. The numbers are almost incomprehensible. 60 billion cubic meters of groundwater vanish every single year. To put that in perspective, that's enough water to fill Lake Erie. Every year, gone, pumped out and consumed, and leaving hollow spaces in the earth where life-sustaining water once sat. This isn't sustainable water use. This isn't even unsustainable water use. This is water theft on a geological scale, systematically robbing the future to pay for the present. A 2025 study analyzing Chinese cities revealed that 180 of them face critical groundwater depletion or contamination crises, affecting over 311 million urban residents. That's close to the entire population of the United States living above aquifers that are collapsing or poisoned, or both. In parts of the North China Plain, China's agricultural heartland, water tables drop 1 to 3 meters every single year. Wells drilled last year don't reach water this year. Farmers watch their irrigation systems sputter and fail. Ancient lakes shrink to toxic puddles ringed with dead fish. Wetlands that sustain migratory birds for millennia turn to cracked mud and dust. But you haven't heard the worst part yet. When you pump water out of the ground, you're not just removing liquid, you're removing the physical support structure holding up everything above it. The soil particles that were suspended in water, held apart by that moisture, start compacting. The ground settles, compresses, sinks, and China is sinking fast. A 2024 satellite study using advanced radar monitoring over 7 years revealed something that should be headline news everywhere. 45% of China's major urban areas are subsiding faster than 3 millimeters per year. 16% are dropping more than 10 millimeters annually. That means 270 million people, more than a quarter of China's urban population, are literally living on land that's falling beneath their feet as you watch this. Beijing's Shaoyang district, packed with gleaming skyscrapers, underground subway networks, vital infrastructure, drops 45 millimeters per year near major transit lines. That's nearly 2 inches of vertical ground loss every 12 months. Roads crack and buckle under the strain of shifting earth. Building foundations settle unevenly, creating structural problems that compound with each passing year. High-speed rail lines warp slightly out of alignment, requiring constant monitoring, adjustment, and expensive repairs. In some districts of Beijing, the ground has fallen 11 centimeters in a single year, more than 4 inches of vertical drop that's enough to cause visible, measurable damage to buildings and critical infrastructure. Imagine your entire city sinking 4 inches while you live there. Most residents don't even realize it's happening until the cracks appear. Shanghai, the crown jewel of Chinese economic power, the city that symbolizes China's rise on the global stage, has subsided over 3 meters since industrialization began a century ago. 3 meters, 10 feet of vertical drop. The city that's supposed to represent China's future is literally collapsing into the earth beneath its own weight, inch by inch, year by year. And it's not just Shanghai. Tianjin, Guangzhou, Ningpu, Fuzhou, all major coastline megacities housing millions, are experiencing the same fate. By 2120, researchers project that 22 to 26% of China's coastal lands will sit below sea level, not from climate change and rising oceans alone, though that's certainly accelerating the crisis, but from the ground itself sinking like the hull of a torpedoed ship slowly going under. Between 55 and 128 million people could end up living in what becomes permanent flood zones. Think about that number. That's more than the population of most countries on Earth, trapped in cities that sit below sea level, vulnerable to every storm surge, every typhoon, every spring tide. Cities that took decades to build, trillions of yuan to develop, could become effectively unlivable in less than a century. Across the countryside, dramatic sinkholes are swallowing fields, roads, houses, and entire buildings without warning. These aren't natural karst formations. They're man-made disasters triggered by groundwater extraction undermining the Earth's structure. The ground becomes hollow like a dried sponge, and then one day, without any warning, it simply collapses. A farmer walks across his field in the morning and the ground opens up beneath him, revealing a cavern that hadn't been there the day before. A section of highway drops 6 feet overnight, stranding vehicles. Buildings tilt and crack as the soil beneath their foundations gives way. Over 60,000 square kilometers of Chinese land, an area larger than the entire nation of Taiwan, has experienced measurable subsidence. The damage already cost China an estimated 7.5 billion yuan annually in infrastructure repairs, compensation, and emergency responses. And that's just what Beijing admits to. The real number is certainly higher. But here's the part Xi Jinping absolutely cannot hide, no matter how much the party tries to censor it. When those engineers drilled 3,280 feet down into Chinese soil, they didn't just find emptiness. They found poison. 80% of China's groundwater wells show contamination when tested. The Lowy Institute, analyzing data from multiple sources, estimates that 80 to 90% of China's groundwater is now unsuitable for drinking without extensive treatment. But it gets worse. 50% of China's groundwater is so toxic that you cannot even use it to irrigate crops. Read that again. Half of the groundwater beneath the world's most populous nation is so contaminated that plants watered with it would absorb toxins. Official government surveys, the ones Beijing cannot suppress without completely destroying any remaining credibility, confirm the nightmare. China's Ministry of Environmental Protection found that 60% of monitored groundwater in cities was classified as seriously contaminated, unfit for human consumption, dangerous even with treatment. Only a tiny fraction of tested wells returned results that qualified as genuinely clean. The Pearl River Delta, one of China's most economically vital regions, provides a case study in catastrophe. Scientists drilled deep and extracted groundwater samples for laboratory analysis. What they found should shock anyone paying attention: arsenic concentrations reaching 161 micrograms per liter. The World Health Organization's safety guideline is 10 micrograms per liter. This water was 16 times over the safe threshold. Drinking water contaminated above 50 micrograms per liter can cause cognitive development damage in children. At 161 micrograms, it's not just unsafe, it's slow-motion poisoning spreading through an entire economic region that houses tens of millions of people. Professor John A. Cherry, one of Canada's leading hydrogeologists who spent years studying China's groundwater crisis firsthand, delivered a chilling assessment in 2016. Up to 80% of water sources in some rural areas may be genuinely unsafe. Farmers across these regions know their irrigation water is contaminated. They can see it, smell it sometimes, watch what happens to their skin when they work in the fields all day. But they have no choice. They use it anyway because there's no alternative. Growing vegetables and rice they themselves refuse to eat. The produce goes to local markets, enters the food supply chain, gets transported to cities, and some of it gets exported internationally. The toxins keep spreading through the system. How did this happen? How does the world's most tightly controlled society allow its most fundamental resource to become poisoned on this scale? One word: corruption. For decades, really since Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms began in the 1980s, local governments prioritized economic growth above everything else. GDP numbers determined whether officials got promoted to Beijing or sidelined to irrelevance. Factories brought jobs, tax revenue, and proof of progress that Communist Party bosses demanded to see on paper. So factories dumped industrial waste into rivers at night when no one was watching. Chemical plants discharge toxins directly in the watersheds, turning entire rivers into chemical soups. Mining operations poison whole regions, leaving behind wastelands where nothing will grow for generations. Environmental officials looked the other way. Either they were bribed directly, or they understood perfectly well that shutting down major polluters would cost their region GDP points, tax revenue, and jobs, which meant it would cost them their careers, their party standing, maybe their freedom. Penalties for environmental violations were laughably small. A factory caught dumping might pay a fine equivalent to a few days' profit, then continue poisoning the water supply the very next week. As long as the factory kept employing workers and filling government coffers, it wasn't going to be shut down over something as seemingly minor as dumping carcinogens into aquifers that millions drink from. One Chinese environmental expert, speaking anonymously to overseas media because publicly criticizing the system in China can end careers, or worse, put it bluntly, water pollution in China is not technically hard to fix. We have the knowledge. We have the technology. It's politically hard to fix because the polluters and the officials don't want to change the status quo. They profit from it. But what's been happening underground over the past decade is even more sinister. Some Chinese industrial companies devised a method to hide pollution from environmental inspectors entirely: high-pressure injection of toxic wastewater directly into deep aquifers. Here's how it works. Using powerful industrial pumps, they drill boreholes down through the rock, sometimes a kilometer deep, 3,280 feet, the exact depth our opening drill reached, and inject concentrated toxic waste directly into deep geological formations that should never be contaminated. By backfilling poisonous effluent into aquifers that are hundreds of meters down, they hide the evidence completely. No visible pollution on the surface, no smell that neighbors can detect, no surface contamination that inspectors can easily find during routine checks. The waste simply disappears underground, out of sight and supposedly out of mind. until people start getting sick years later and can't figure out why. A 2013 field survey conducted by researchers from the Chinese Academy of Engineering uncovered this practice and estimated something almost unbelievable. 16 billion tons of industrial wastewater were being secretly dumped underground every single year. 16 billion tons! Those deep aquifers move extremely slowly. Water down there might take centuries or even millennia to flow and filter through rock layers. Contamination injected today will poison those zones for hundreds of years, perhaps forever. When groundwater moves that slowly, there's no natural cleansing process that can fix this kind of industrial-scale poisoning. When citizens in Shandong accused factories of underground injection, linking it to cancer spikes, online outcry forced investigations. Some arrests, a few plugged wells, but thousands of injection sites likely still operate, poisoning the water table. The human cost is staggering. Cancer villages have emerged, communities where cancer rates explode far above normal. The correlation with contaminated water is undeniable. State media eventually acknowledge the phenomenon, though they rarely investigate industrial causes. Rural health systems struggle with waterborne diseases. Diarrhea remains the leading cause of death among children under 5. And then there are the visual nightmares censorship can't hide. In 2012, the Yellow River turned blood red from chemical discharge. A Wenzhou River turned crimson overnight. Locals called it the Red River. Another ran bright yellow, reeking of industrial waste. Lake Taihu became fluorescent green algae soup in 2007, cutting off drinking water to millions. And then Shanghai, March 2013. Over 12,000 dead pig carcasses floated down the Huangpu River, a main water source for 23 million people. For days, bloated pig bodies bobbed past Shanghai's skyline. Farmers had dumped diseased livestock rather than dispose of them properly. The images went global. You can't censor thousands of pig corpses. Around that time, government reports admitted 200 million rural Chinese lacked safe drinking water. 200 million. Testing found cadmium contamination in rice from Hunan and Guangdong, staple food laced with heavy metals from polluted irrigation. And here's what should terrify everyone watching. China is one of the world's largest food exporters. Garlic, apple juice, fish, processed foods. If grown with contaminated water, these toxins don't respect borders. They end up in New York, London, Tokyo. Chinese seafood has been rejected by importers due to pollutant residues traced to polluted water sources. A 2018 Tsinghua study found water, soil, and air pollution form a vicious cycle. Water pollutes crops, contaminated soil leaches into groundwater, polluted air creates toxic rain. The poisons spread everywhere, reinforcing each other endlessly. So what happens when 1.4 billion people run out of clean water? Scholars estimate supply could fall short by 25% by 2030, 5 years away. A 25% deficit means systemic collapse, abandoned cities, mass migration, agricultural failure. The North China Plain, China's breadbasket, depends on groundwater for 60% of wheat and 45% of corn. Over 7.5 million wells drain ancient aquifers irrigating farmland nearly the size of Oklahoma. NASA satellites show between 2003 and 2010, North China lost groundwater equal to twice Beijing's annual consumption every year. If the North China Plain suffers a 33% crop loss, a plausible scenario, China would need to import 20% of globally traded corn and 13% of wheat. That would send global food prices skyrocketing. Poor nations would face immediate hunger. Geopolitical tensions would explode. And it's not just agriculture. China is the factory floor of the world. Those factories run on water. A severe drought affecting hydropower could knock out hundreds of terawatt hours, equivalent to entire nations' annual generation. That leaves coal, burning massive additional amounts, accelerating climate change, worsening air quality. The South-North Water Transfer Project, Xi's signature achievement meant to solve everything, is proving insufficient. At $70 billion, it's the largest water project ever attempted, but it's not enough. The transferred water costs 6 yuan per cubic meter. Local governments still drill free groundwater, sell it cheap, pocket the difference. The Grand Canal runs below capacity while officials drain the earth dry for profit. Beijing knows. In 2021, China enacted its first national groundwater regulation. Officials admitted over 20 provinces are overpumping, some tapping ultra-deep reserves that should never be touched. When a regime that covers up disasters admits publicly to catastrophe, it's already too late. Some progress has been made. Shanghai limited withdrawals, slowing subsidence. The water transfer stabilized Beijing's levels in some districts. Tokyo offers hope. Sank 15 feet but reversed it through strict pumping bans. But China has 1.4 billion people. The scale is incomprehensible. And unlike Tokyo, China's groundwater isn't just depleted, it's poisoned. You can pump water back into aquifers, but you cannot unpollute deep groundwater contaminated with industrial toxins. That's a generational problem, maybe civilizational. Xi Jinping can't hide this anymore. For all the party's control, they can't censor reality, can't stop rivers from dying, can't prevent ground from sinking, can't make poison wells safe by deleting posts. Nature rebels against the cover-up. When fish leap from polluted ponds choosing death, no propaganda explains it. When cameras capture blood-red rivers faster than censors delete them, truth gets out. Truth bubbles from 3,280 feet down carried in toxic groundwater that can't sustain 1.4 billion people. The drill exposed more than geology. It exposed the lie at China's heart. That growth can't continue forever. That resources are infinite. That party control extends over nature. It doesn't. Water is the source of life. If poisoned or dried up, civilizations cannot survive. For thousands of years, Chinese dynasties rose and fell with rivers. The Yellow River gave birth to Chinese civilization. When rivers failed, dynasties collapsed. Xi and the party knows this. It's why they've thrown billions at water projects, declared wars on pollution, passed regulations. But they're learning what every dynasty learned. You cannot defy hydrology through political will. The aquifers took tens of thousands of years to fill. China drained them in decades. No technology can fix this on the timeline they need. What happens next will reshape the century. If China cannot secure water, we'll witness the largest migration in human history. Agricultural collapse, supply chains breaking down. Food price spikes destabilizing governments. Commodity shortages, geopolitical instability on unprecedented scales. The drill that went 3,280 feet down didn't just find a water crisis, it found the future. Seeping through cracks in sinking cities, flowing from contaminated taps, absent from dried riverbeds that once sustained empires. Xi Jinping cannot bury this secret. The earth exposes the truth. One drained aquifer, one sinking city, one poison well. Water is life. China is running out of both. No propaganda can change that. So what do you think? Can China engineer its way out, or are we watching the collapse of a civilization built on borrowed water? Let us know in the comments. And if you want to stay ahead of the geopolitical stories shaping our world, subscribe to Fall of Nations.
Communism didn't vanish in China. It went underground, and now it's rising again. The West spent decades celebrating China's rise, the skyscrapers, the GDP, the tech boom. But beneath all that glass and steel, one thing never changed. The Communist Party never let go. It adapted. It hid behind market reforms. And then, slowly, it began to choke everything it had helped create. Now, China's miracle is unraveling. The population is shrinking. The private sector is suffocating. Youth unemployment is exploding. And the communist system that once built the boom is now dragging the entire country into stagnation and decay. This isn't a downturn. It's a political time bomb. And it's ticking faster than anyone thought. Let's break down how the past is eating China's future alive, and why the collapse that's coming won't be loud, but slow, grinding, and inescapable. The West got played. For decades, we watched China's transformation and told ourselves a comforting story that economic freedom would eventually lead to political freedom, that capitalism would erode communism from within, that the party would fade as prosperity grew. We were wrong. Dead wrong. In 1978, Deng Xiaoping struck a deal that would define China for the next half-century. The bargain was simple, brutal, and brilliant. You can get rich, we keep absolute power. No elections, no independent courts, no free press, no opposition parties. Just prosperity in exchange for obedience. And for a while, it worked. Investors poured in billions, convinced they were witnessing the birth of a new economic superpower. But here's what everyone missed. The reforms were never about freedom. They were about survival. The Communist Party was on the brink after Mao's catastrophic experiments killed tens of millions through famine and chaos. Deng saved the party by giving it a new purpose, delivering growth. But the iron cage of one-party rule, that never budged an inch. The party controlled the police, the military, the courts, the media. Every lever of power stayed firmly in their hands. Markets were allowed to flourish, but only as long as they served the party's interests. Step out of line and you disappear. This was the illusion of reform, a communist regime that looked like it was liberalizing, but was actually just getting better at hiding its authoritarian core. And the world bought it. Hook, line, and sinker. For years, this hybrid model delivered astonishing results. Double-digit GDP growth, hundreds of millions lifted out of poverty, gleaming infrastructure built at breakneck speed. The party excelled at mobilization, at forcing compliance, at bulldozing obstacles. When Beijing wanted something done, it got done. No protests, no delays, just raw, centralized power unleashed on a massive scale. But here's the thing about authoritarian efficiency. It works brilliantly in the catch-up phase. When you're building highways, copying foreign technology, and throwing cheap labor at manufacturing, you don't need creativity or freedom. You just need discipline and capital. And China had both in abundance. But the very strengths that powered the boom were quietly planting the seeds of collapse. Because a system built on fear and obedience can mobilize people, but it can't inspire them. Innovation dies in climates where questioning authority is dangerous. Trust evaporates when everyone suspects their neighbor might inform on them. And when political priorities trump economic logic, vast sums get misallocated into ghost cities, redundant factories, and zombie enterprises that drain resources for decades. The cracks were forming long before anyone noticed. Each year, it took more debt to generate less growth. Returns on investment kept shrinking. The easy gains were drying up. But as long as the growth numbers looked good on paper, nobody asked whether the foundation was rotting from within. And then came Xi Jinping. In 2012, he inherited a country transformed by 3 decades of reform and burdened by every contradiction we've just described. Some hoped he'd be a reformer, others feared he'd be a hardliner. Turns out he's something more dangerous, the system's truest believer. Xi didn't break the Chinese model, he perfected it. He revealed what it always was. A communist dictatorship that had temporarily loosened its grip, but never let go. And now that grip is tightening like a vice. In 2018, Xi scrapped presidential term limits, clearing the path to rule for life. The anti-corruption campaign he launched? Sure, it caught some corrupt officials, but it also purged rivals, terrified the bureaucracy into submission, and concentrated power in his hands to a degree not seen since Mao. Today, Xi commands absolute authority. There are no checks, no balances, no opposition. The party answers to him and him alone. And what has he done with that power? He's turned the clock backward. Tech billionaires who got too big, too independent, too bold, crushed. Jack Ma, once the face of China's entrepreneurial spirit, criticized regulators in 2020. His company's massive IPO was canceled overnight. He vanished from public view for months. The message was crystal clear. No one is untouchable. The private sector exists at the party's pleasure, and that pleasure can be revoked in an instant. Xi's regulators have since kneecapped the tech industry with wave after wave of crackdowns, fines, restrictions, forced restructuring. Innovation hubs that were once buzzing with energy now operate under a cloud of fear. Entrepreneurs spend more time studying party doctrine than building products, because in Xi's China, ideological loyalty matters more than market success. Meanwhile, surveillance has metastasized into every corner of life. Cameras with facial recognition track your movements. Social credit systems monitor your behavior. Apps on your phone report what you read, who you talk to, what you buy. Dissent isn't just discouraged, it's digitally cataloged and punished. Students who question the party line find themselves blacklisted. Activists disappeared into detention. Civil society organizations have been systematically dismantled. Independent voices silenced. The goal is total control. Xi calls it common prosperity. The reality, economic strangulation wrapped in communist rhetoric. And it's working exactly as intended. The party is stronger than ever, but the economy? Well, that's a different story. Because while Xi was busy consolidating power and enforcing ideological purity, the economic engine that powered China's rise started to sputter, then stall, then seize. Youth unemployment skyrocketed past 20% in 2023, and then the government simply stopped publishing the data. When the numbers got too embarrassing, just hide them. Problem solved, right? Except millions of young Chinese graduates know the truth. They're living it. 4 years of university, crushing competition, endless exams. All for what? No jobs, no prospects, no future. They call it lying flat, or let it rot. A generation so disillusioned, they're opting out of the system entirely. The real estate market, which accounted for nearly 30% of China's economy, is imploding. Property giants like Evergrande and Country Garden, companies once worth hundreds of billions, have defaulted on their debts. They owe more money than they could ever repay. Unfinished apartment towers sit abandoned across the country. Ghost cities stretch for miles. Home buyers who poured their life savings into pre-construction units now own nothing but broken promises. And local governments, which funded themselves by selling land to developers, are drowning in hidden debt. The revenue stream is gone, the bills are coming due, and there's no bailout big enough to fix it. Meanwhile, GDP growth, the single metric the party staked its legitimacy on, is slowing to levels not seen in decades. The official numbers say around 5%. Independent analysts think it's lower. Some think it's much lower. In 2010, a top Chinese official admitted that GDP statistics were man-made and unreliable. Nothing has changed since. The numbers are whatever Beijing needs them to be. But here's the thing, even if the numbers are real, they're built on a foundation of unsustainable debt. Corporate debt alone is over 160% of GDP. Local government debt is hidden in thousands of off-balance sheet financing vehicles. Nobody knows the true extent of the liabilities. Zombie state-owned enterprises that should have failed years ago are kept alive with endless loans because letting them collapse would be politically unacceptable. Banks evergreen bad debts rather than write them off, roll over the loans, pretend they're performing, kick the can down the road. The entire system is pretending everything is fine while the ground beneath them crumbles. And foreign investors? They're getting out. Capital is fleeing China faster than it's coming in. Companies are moving supply chains to Vietnam, India, Mexico, anywhere but China. The geopolitical environment has soured. The regulatory unpredictability has spooked everyone. The era of easy integration into the global economy is over. And Xi's response to all of this? Tighten control even more. This isn't a cyclical downturn, it's structural collapse in slow motion. And it's getting worse. Because underneath all these economic failures lies a demographic catastrophe that China inflicted on itself and can never undo. In 1980, the Communist Party made one of the most arrogant decisions in human history. They decided they could engineer the perfect population. The one-child policy was born. For 35 years, the state invaded the most intimate corners of people's lives. Women pregnant without permission were forced into abortions. Families were fined, harassed, destroyed. Rural areas, desperate for sons to carry on the family name, quietly committed infanticide against baby girls. The gender imbalance became grotesque. Today, China has roughly 30 million more men than women. 30 million men who will never find a wife, never start a family, never have children of their own. That's an entire generation of surplus males, a recipe for social instability that no one knows how to solve. But the consequences go far beyond gender ratios. In 2022, for the first time in almost 60 years, China's population declined. The number of deaths exceeded births. The decline has only accelerated since. By mid-century, China will lose hundreds of millions of people. Not from war, not from disease, but from a policy choice made by technocrats who thought they could control fertility like a factory production line. And now the bill is coming due. The workforce is shrinking every single year. Fewer workers mean fewer taxpayers, fewer consumers, fewer innovators. Meanwhile, the number of elderly retirees is exploding. The dependency ratio is skyrocketing. In the past, Chinese families had multiple children to care for aging parents. Now, thanks to the one-child policy, you have the 4-2-1 problem. One adult child responsible for 2 parents and 4 grandparents. The math doesn't work. The burden is unbearable. The social fabric is tearing. And the cruelest irony? The party is now begging people to have more children. They've relaxed the policy to 2 kids, then 3. Propaganda posters plaster cities urging young couples to embrace parenthood. State media runs campaigns celebrating large families. But young Chinese aren't interested. They grew up as pampered only children in families that poured everything into them. They've watched housing costs soar beyond reach. In major cities, an apartment can cost 40 times the average annual salary. They've seen the economy stagnate and opportunities evaporate. Education costs are crushing. The competition is brutal. The 996 work culture, 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week, leaves no time for family life. They don't trust the future, and they definitely don't trust the party that spent decades forcing their parents' generation to abort pregnancies and now suddenly wants babies. The phrase circulating online says it all. I won't bring a child into this. You can't command fertility. You can't bully people into reproduction. The damage is done, and it's irreversible. By the end of this century, China could lose 400 million people. The world's most populous nation is headed toward demographic extinction, and there's nothing Beijing can do to stop it. If you're finding this eye-opening, hit subscribe to Fall of Nations, because what comes next gets even darker. The demographic collapse is just beginning. And just when China needs innovation most, the brightest minds are heading for the exits. Educated Chinese, the scientists, engineers, entrepreneurs who could lead the next phase of growth are leaving in droves. Students go abroad for university and don't come back. Researchers take jobs in Singapore, the US, Europe, anywhere with intellectual freedom and opportunity. The brain gain that China enjoyed for decades has reversed into a terminal brain drain. And who can blame them? Why stay in a country where you're constantly surveilled? Where questioning authority can destroy your career? Where innovation is stifled by ideological litmus tests? Academia is censored, research is controlled, entire fields of inquiry are off limits if they contradict party orthodoxy. You can track every citizen's footsteps with facial recognition. You can monitor every transaction, every conversation, every click. But you can't force people to stay. You can't innovate your way to prosperity when your best minds are fleeing. The surveillance state creates a paradox. Total control, zero inspiration. Fear keeps people in line, but it also kills creativity. And without creativity, without risk-taking, without the freedom to fail and try again, economies stagnate. China is learning this lesson the hard way. The students who remain whisper a chilling verdict. There's no future here, only obedience. That's the voice of a generation that's given up. Not just on the economy, on the system itself. They see the writing on the wall. Work hard, stay quiet, obey the rules, and still end up with nothing. So why bother? The social contract is broken. The promise of prosperity in exchange for submission no longer holds. And Xi's solution? More propaganda, more nationalism, more control. But the fewer voices that remain, the louder the party has to scream to drown out the silence. Because in a country of 1.4 billion people, the most dangerous sound is the one Beijing can't stand. The sound of hope dying. And as hope fades, fear spreads like frost. Welcome to the new era of Chinese governance, the fear state. It never really went away, it just wore a mask during the boom years. Now the mask is off. Social credit systems track your behavior and punish deviation. Miss a debt payment? Blacklisted. Criticize the government online? Blacklisted. Associate with the wrong people? Blacklisted. Your ability to travel, get loans, even send your kids to good schools depends on your score. And the score is controlled by the state. Facial recognition cameras blanket every major city. AI algorithms track your movements, your associations, your habits. Uyghurs in Xinjiang live under a dystopian surveillance regime so extreme it's being called a digital concentration camp. But the tools being perfected there? They're spreading nationwide. Arrests for online speech have skyrocketed. A joke on WeChat can land you in detention. A shared article criticizing party policy can end your career. Lawyers who defend dissidents are disbarred or disappeared. Journalists who investigate corruption are jailed. Civil society has been systematically crushed. There are no independent labor unions in China. All unions answer to the state. Religious groups must register with the government and toe the party line. Underground churches are raided. Falun Gong practitioners are persecuted. NGOs that focused on human rights or governance have been shuttered or driven underground. Any institution that could serve as a check on party power has been neutralized or destroyed. What remains is an atomized population, 1 billion individuals connected vertically to the state, but lacking horizontal bonds of trust. And in a society where trust has been eroded for 70 years, the economic consequences are devastating. Officials lie about data because admitting failure is career suicide. Companies cook their books because transparency is dangerous. Banks hide bad loans because acknowledging them would trigger panic. Local governments report fake GDP numbers because Beijing demands growth targets be met. The entire system runs on deception, and when everyone knows everyone is lying, trust collapses. Investors don't know which companies are sound. Lenders don't know which loans are good. Citizens don't know which statistics are real. It's an economy built on quicksand, and the cracks are starting to show. You don't need a labor camp when your phone already tracks your sins. You don't need gulags when social credit scores can destroy you quietly, digitally, efficiently. This is totalitarianism optimized for the 21st century. Orwell's 1984 with Chinese characteristics. And as fear spreads, the economy doesn't just slow, it freezes. Because when people are afraid, they don't take risks. They don't start businesses. They don't invest. They don't spend. They hoard cash and keep their heads down. Entrepreneurs stop innovating and start studying party doctrine. Officials stop making bold decisions and start covering their tracks. The system becomes paralyzed by its own paranoia. And at the center of it all is Xi Jinping, tightening his grip even as the country he rules crumbles beneath him. Here's the fatal contradiction that the Communist Party can no longer avoid. The system demands absolute political control, and the people demand ever-rising living standards. For decades, those two goals aligned. The party delivered growth, and the people tolerated authoritarian rule. But now those goals have collided head-on. To keep delivering prosperity, China needs the dynamism that comes from openness, flexibility, trust, and freedom. It needs entrepreneurs willing to take risks without fearing arbitrary crackdowns. It needs young people optimistic about the future. It needs institutions that can adapt through honest feedback. It needs innovation, and innovation requires freedom to question, to experiment, to fail, to challenge authority. But freedom is the one thing the Communist Party will never allow, because freedom threatens control, and control is what the party values above all else. So they're left with an impossible choice: loosening the reins and risk losing power, or tightening control and watch the economy stagnate. We know which path they've chosen, and we know where it leads. The collapse isn't coming, it's already here. It's just happening quietly. Local governments are drowning in hidden debt they can never repay. The numbers are staggering. Estimates run into the trillions of dollars. For years, they funded themselves by selling land to developers. Now the real estate market has imploded and the revenue is gone, but the debt remains. Infrastructure projects that were supposed to drive growth now sit half-finished and abandoned. High-speed rail lines run nearly empty. Airports built for millions of passengers see a fraction of that. Entire districts of gleaming office towers stand vacant. It's not just waste, it's the visible evidence of a system that can't allocate resources efficiently, because politics always trumps economics. The economy isn't crashing in a spectacular blaze, it's calcifying, ossifying, freezing into stagnation. GDP growth, once the envy of the world, is grinding to a halt. Official projections keep getting revised downward. The demographic decline guarantees that growth will keep slowing for decades to come. Fewer workers, fewer consumers, an aging population draining resources that should be invested in the future. And the party's response? More propaganda, more nationalism, more rallying against external enemies. They can't fix the structural problems, so they're trying to distract from them. Blame the Americans, blame the Japanese, blame anyone but the system itself. But the system is the problem, and everyone knows it. The communist DNA that powered the early boom is now the poison killing the patient. You can't innovate without freedom. You can't build trust without transparency. You can't adapt without feedback. And you can't sustain growth when fear replaces ambition. China's greatest enemy isn't America. It isn't demographics. It isn't debt. It's the political structure that refuses to evolve. The party thought it could have it both ways: market dynamism and political control, prosperity and dictatorship, innovation and obedience. For a while, it worked, but that era is over. The contradictions have caught up, and there's no way out. The world thought China's collapse would be loud: tanks in the streets, revolution in Tiananmen Square, a Soviet-style implosion. But it's not happening that way. It's happening in silence, in empty apartments, in unemployed graduates lying flat, in researchers leaving for foreign labs, in birth rates that keep falling, in debt that keeps growing, in surveillance that keeps tightening, in hope that keeps fading. This is what collapse looks like in the 21st century. Not a bang, a slow grinding suffocation, and the shadow of communism, the shadow that never left, just hid in the dark, is the hand around China's throat. The party chose control over growth, and in the end, they'll have neither. Because you can't command an economy to grow with slogans and censorship. You can't force innovation with surveillance and fear. You can't reverse demographic collapse with propaganda. And you can't build a prosperous future on a foundation of lies. China's miracle is over. What comes next is the reckoning, and it will be slow, grinding, and inescapable. The communist shadow of the past is crushing the future, and there's no escape. So, what do you think? Is this the beginning of the end for the Chinese Communist Party? Or will they double down even harder, tightening control until the whole system collapses under its own weight? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more hard-hitting geopolitical analysis that cuts through the noise, subscribe to Fall of Nations, because while the world sleeps, empires crumble. And we're here to show you exactly how it happens.